Are they coming up? Is Here We Still Stand happening in October? Because I haven't heard shit about
as far
it.
as I know.
I haven't seen any advertising. They haven't sent out any more emails.
They talk about it on a couple of the podcasts talk about it.
Oh, do they? Nice.
Yeah. Ooh, look at that. It's $435 now. They raised the price.
For the conference?
Mm-hmm.
Which one? Higher Things?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
That's the early bird.
I suppose to make up for, what's that called? The $80,000 she cost them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. You know this is live, right? Okay.
It is now. I didn't say names. No names. More a melody.
Good. Yeah, we let people jump on here. Let's see. Donovan Riley. Let's see what you're listed on their site.
For whom?
For you. As Lutheran as it gets. Yeah. Yeah, it's all over on the site. Speaker index. Oh, you wrote some reflections too, it looks like.
I wrote a lot of reflections. Yeah.
Well. The end times, still all about Jesus.
I wrote stuff. I talked about stuff. And I moved on.
Me too.
Yeah. I'm not, what's that called? A team player.
No, that's okay though. I think,
I'm super comfortable with that.
Well, and probably should just wait and include it in the show. But that's ultimately kind of what Dreher, whatever, argues for here. Mm-hmm. You know, don't be team players. Not when it comes to, lies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Tom, good morning.
I suppose we should just hit record now since we're going to go dive
Yeah,
right
we're going to
into
go.
this.
All right. Let's record. Let's play some music. Other
go.
people will join in as they can, as they will. Band books, War Chant. This one, yeah.
Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the Band Books Podcast, episode number 222. Only took me 221 episodes to get that down. So Don't say I can't change. Don't say I can't learn.
Grow, improve.
Grow, get better. Become more sanctified. Holier and holier, day by day, step by step.
It's just a number, man. It's just a number.
So is everything I'm saying. As always, we are your host, Christopher Gillespie.
Chillin' and Willin', Maxin' and Relaxin'.
And I am Donovan Riley. Morning Paul, morning Tom, morning Melody on the live stream. Welcome to everybody listening to the podcast in their car, at home, at work, wherever you may be. Thank you for giving us your time and attention today for the podcast. We're going to jump back into Live Not by Lies by Rod Dreher. We're going to go back into what we were discussing, in the last couple episodes.
Yeah.
Which is
a manual for Christian dissidents.
There we go. I was read the manual part.
Yeah, manual. It's good. Yeah, and that's what we're getting into now. We did last week, Google this week. The actual practical use of this knowledge.
Yes. And then to that point, as we continue on the conversation that we started in the previous episodes, we are going to dive into the topic of truth-telling. Because primarily in the church, it is, I would argue, imperative for the vitality of the Church of Christ. And just in your daily vocation, truth-telling is vital for the maintenance of honest relationships.
Well, in actual fact, there is no Christian faith apart from Christian proclamation, apart from telling the truth of what we have, from the Word, from history, etc.
Right. Well, specifically, Jesus says of himself, I am the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So then I think you always have to make the distinction between big T truth, who is a person, Jesus, and then the smaller t, which would be the truth about Jesus, the truth about God, the truth about your vocation, the truth about
ancient aliens,
whatever it might be. But especially in a postmodern society in which words mean nothing to most people. And as I was looking at this morning, what certain groups, what certain sects do is they invent words and then they invent definitions for those words in order to control the conversation, to distinguish what they want the truth to be versus objective truth, for example.
Like cisgender, for example.
Cisgender, TERF, stuff like that.
That was a new one I didn't learn until Chappelle. So there you go.
Right. Yeah. And essentially, like I said, what it is, well, one, it's commonly referred to as my truth, your truth. so that we can essentially, maybe implicitly, argue that there is no such thing as objective truth or objective facts anymore. There's simply my truth, which is to say my opinion, and yours. And then
That's really just subjectivity then, not objectivity.
it is, but what I don't think people grasp is the insidious nature of that ideology, which is contained within my truth and your truth is power games. This is power games. Yeah. And what happens when we come to a debate then about your truth versus my truth is whoever has the most power. And remember that the only way for me to enforce my ideas upon you, if you don't agree with me in this context, is through the threat of violence. So power games always carry with them an implicit threat of violence.
Correct.
And therefore, it's not enough to say my truth versus your truth, and I believe I'm right and you're wrong. You need to now accept that I am right, and not only accept that I'm right and agree with me, but then adopt my way of speech, my way of thought, my way of behaving. Because if you don't, in a benign way, I'm going to cancel you. I'm going to block you on social media. I'm going to complain and try and get your account deleted. But more maliciously, I'm going to dox you and publish on social media your address and your phone number, your whatever it might be. We're going to come and protest outside of your house. We're going to throw things at your house. We're going to key your car or burn your car, whatever it might be. That's the politics of postmodernity and these language games that we play with the truth.
When I was going to suggest, it's all relationships. It's not just politics, but politics is a great example of it. I found a post this morning, somebody who's a scientist that studies and evaluates game theory. So that's a whole field of science. Yeah. That these games we play, they can actually be categorized, and there's different names. So there's one that's called the Nash equilibrium. All right, so I haven't heard about this, but there's a whole formula that governs it. And so this guy who does game theory, but he's also an economist, he looked at this political conflict about the debt ceiling. And he's evaluated it so far, and it says it's fitting this particular game, this bargaining game called the Nash equilibrium. And the point is, the reason I bring it up is that it's an equilibrium. You're just looking for a compromise, but it's not actually about, there's no actually ideological commitment, to like, well, debt is bad or, or debt above this level is poor. It's just a matter of you get what you get, I get what I get. And it doesn't matter who we actually hurt in the process, as long as we both win and everybody else loses.
Right, exactly.
Which is the political game, of course, because they're governed primarily by selfishness, self-enrichment, and secondarily power in order to enrich themselves.
Correct. Right.
At least that's my theory. Some say you said it was power over money, but I think it's money ultimately is driving their power games.
Or they're hand in glove for them.
Or it's just the same thing.
Money's the vehicle.
Power is wealth.
But the people that control them don't care about money because they have so much power that money is meaningless.
Or they have so much money that money is meaningless.
Same thing, right? An oil sheik in Qatar has so much money that he doesn't know how much money he has. And
so it's all power. So the only thing left worth pursuing is power at that point.
Power, exactly. And the fact that he has so much money and he possesses so much wealth, and by the way, he possesses so many people that at that point, and it builds up that momentum. It's like you see celebrity. D and C level celebrities, you'll see them doing commercials, you'll see them doing independent films, you'll see them being really nice toward other people and kind toward other people and very complimentary. And then the higher up they go, the more isolated they become, and yet there's more zeros behind their name and their houses. You talk about like Johnny Depp and how he had to sell like something like 15 or 16 of his houses. And it's like, dude, and he's like, I don't know how I got that many. I have so much money. And you
got to put it somewhere. Yeah,
you got to put it in physical assets. So I just buy houses everywhere I go. It's like at that point, and because of who you are and because of what you possess and what you represent, I think that's the key to power is what do you represent to the other person? Yeah. Do you represent somebody who can get the thing that I want, or do you represent somebody who can't help me get through that door, for example?
And what I'm trying to suggest is that it's not actually any kind of, it's not truth seeking. It's not truth telling. No. It's not connected to that at all. I mean, Nebuchadnezzar is a good example of this, right? Yeah. Or as I call him, Chad. Yeah. King Chad.
Right.
because it's shorter and you don't have to keep saying his name over and over then.
original
Nebuchadnezzar, it's
Chad.
like, look at how easy it is to manipulate, for satraps to manipulate him into just, a new law. Oh, just bow down when the music plays. Yeah, it's a big statue of you. Isn't that great? He's like, oh yeah, that's great. And, go through a whole, pretty interesting story to get to the point where he says, maybe you guys, Daniel or the other guys, you guys are right. Or at least you're partially right. You're at least more right enough that I'll acknowledge that. Right. But that he has no humility at the front end of the story, and he only has a little bit by the end.
Right.
So he's so consumed by wealth and power that, he's not even really human at that point.
Yeah. Well, and as our Chad points out on the live stream,
Hey,
money
Chad.
is an expression of power. I would actually say it's a representation of power and money, but same thing.
Oh, it's a token value.
Yeah. It represents my power and influence. So when you see, for example, Robert Downey Jr. gets paid $20+ million, $50 million to make a movie, that number represents his value to the Hollywood establishment, to the business.
It's the same. It's the same with sports athletes.
Oh, absolutely.
Professional athletes too. You're like, these numbers don't even.
No.
They don't even represent any kind of reality.
No, they
Doesn't
represent your value to the organization, but they're not. They don't really recommend. It's not a reality. It's just a number. Like
right,
this
or fans,
podcast.
or to the fans too, right?
Right.
I mean, they want to see their most their favorite player be rewarded.
Right. It becomes totemic at that point too.
Yeah.
The person becomes totemic. The money represents their power and influence or agency, but then they themselves become non-human. They become totemic.
Right,
I want
but
to
so
touch
it's
him. I
not-
want his autograph. I want to hang around with him. I want to be him.
So it's not objective. It is subjectivity.
Yeah.
And you're creating an artificial reality
Fiat currency is worthless. It has zero value
unless you give it value,
unless you give it value. Exactly. Which is when it becomes a god.
and other people recognize the value you've given it. Yeah.
Exactly. And therein lies the true power. Because
But
you
that's
and
true
I
for
could
anything.
actually, you and I could publish our own currency.
Sure.
You can actually do that within the United States. We could publish our own currency. Up until the late 1800s, that was the problem, is that, well, think of the Civil War. There was two kinds of currency. And had the South won, my family, you and I would definitely wouldn't be having this conversation right now, because I would be wealthy and I wouldn't even know you, because way back in the Revolutionary War, my family owned tobacco plantations in the South.
Sure.
And then there was an incident involving a slave girl and the guy down the road who was having an affair with the same slave girl that one of my ancestors was having an affair with. And they got in a duel, and my ancestor shot the dude and had to flee, and he headed north. And that was
It's always the slave girl.
Right.
Always the slave girl.
So everything just ruined. But then the Civil War took care of, everything for that. And that money then, Confederate money, has no value except to collectors in the present.
Right.
tense.
But I mean, even something that we think have intrinsic value, like gold, for example, it only has intrinsic value in that it's useful,
Right.
that it doesn't corrode,
Right.
or doesn't tarnish like silver.
Right.
So it can be, and it can use for that electrical property. So it's useful for that.
But
Obviously
this is a great conversation, even if we're doing it in a very generalized sort of way and not going too deep, is the end of feudalism was the implementation of basically the gold standard in Europe. They moved from a barter system,
Right.
a primarily bartered system, and I bring this up because it's really indicative of the old Adam in a nutshell, that we are so anti-creation that anything that God gives us of any actual value, we devalue. And then anything that God gives to us that doesn't have that value, such as gold and minerals and diamonds, we elevate that to the highest value. So we say, well, this diamond is worth way more than this loaf of bread.
Well,
But
I mean, in
in
some
actual-
sense it is, because it's rare, right? More rare. And it has usefulness in that, it's a hard
It has
surface.
zero usefulness, practically speaking.
No, that's
Zero.
not true. You use it for cutting and other things, industrial use. But yeah, the point being, but the real point here is that we assign a value to something that isn't intrinsically valuable if it's portable. That's the key when it comes to currency, right? So diamonds, gold, these are things that are portable, they're permanent, they don't expire like bread. So you can say, I'm going to give you this much for this, bread, or for bread that I need in a month, right? And then you can offset the barter through exchange.
But this
of
brings us
currency.
back to truth telling.
Right.
The truth of the matter is, there are three things that we need to live, and you can add two to that to make it a rounded off 5. Food, shelter, and water. These are necessary. And then you can add fire and medicine if you want to after that. But the only three things that are necessary for life are food, shelter, water. All of those are readily available for everybody.
Right. Yeah, and yeah, it's some food you'd like fire so that you can cook it. So
Yeah, sure. But the
Or
point
if you
is,
live
you
too
don't
far
need
north,
gold and
yeah.
diamonds. You don't need printed money to survive.
Nope.
And I think that's really what happened is that, like we've talked about here, and I've talked about on the Warrior Priest podcast a lot, which is when we move from a survival economy to a meaning economy, that's when everything changed.
Right.
Because instead of worrying about, hey, I got to eat today and I got to go out and forage and I have to make sure that the rain doesn't get through the roof of my hut, we move from that to, is there a God? What is the meaning of my life?
Right.
What's my identity? When we moved there, all of a sudden you'll notice economically everything changed too.
Well, and that's I'm reading through. I was reading through Samuel and now into Kings,
Right.
and that's exactly what happens when they move away from the nomadic life of the wilderness into the Promised Land and establish Jerusalem. David establishes Jerusalem.
Right.
They set up the city. They set up the temple.
Right.
They become very wealthy, and then you have Solomon with his Proverbs.
Right.
You know, his Proverbs and Psalms, and then they pretty quickly fall into heathenism again.
Yeah. You and I were texting about this, so I'll bring it up on the podcast because it's a question though. The older you get, the more seasoned you become as an exegete. Because I was talking to you about this in reference to Judges, but it obviously fits with what you just said too. I don't believe that the people of Israel ever actually converted. I think it was exactly
Not
the
in
same as it
total.
is today.
Yeah, not in
I
total.
think there was a remnant in Israel, the hidden church, but the rest of them were godless the whole time. They were just herded into fidelity to the Lord.
How many of the people that are like in exile in Babylon are even named?
Right. Right.
There's not that many that seem to be all that interested.
No.
And then of the people that remained, that were left there to farm the land, right, by the Babylonians. And then the prophets are speaking to them, and they're like, "What are you talking about?"
Exactly. Yeah. Well, we're talking about the midwives in Egypt.
Yeah, same story.
They were the only ones who actually remembered to cry out to the Lord specifically. Everyone else was just crying. But I think maybe that's where we get hung up in the present tense is we
Or to
look
do
around-
anything about anything about the oppression. Yeah.
We complain and we whine in the present tense about the lack of fidelity and liberty and charity that happens in the church as a consequence of preaching and catechization, secondly. But if we look at the history of Israel, nothing's really changed.
No.
Not really.
No.
There's a remnant. Most people are just satisfied to worship God in a general sense. And it's only when a really strong charismatic leader appointed by God shows up, like a Gideon, like a David, whoever it might be, like you said, and when the prophets show up, everyone just kind of shrugs and goes back to work. It's like that scene in the Holy Grail when King Arthur's talking to the serfs.
Right.
He's like, I'm the king of the Britons. And they're like, we didn't vote for you. Like, they don't
I'm
care.
being repressed.
It's like we talked about. People in Afghanistan, over 90%, 9 out of 10 people don't even know who Osama bin Laden is, let alone what
Some
September 11th was.
watery tot, with
Yeah,
the
some
sword.
watery tart.
You know.
Give you a sword. Yeah.
There's no basis for a government.
Right. And I think for those of us who are really deep in the life of the church and really deep in the word, and as we've talked about, take the vocation of preaching very, very seriously, it can become like blinders almost, where you try and see the whole world through that lens of, well, but I'm over here doing my thing and my congregation, and let's be honest, you and I both know this, so shout out to everybody in our churches that's listening to this podcast. But we know there's people in our congregation who are just showing up on Sundays because it's a part of their ritual. It's on their schedule, but they don't have...
Never mind the ones who don't show up at all. But
Well, yeah. I mean, the tourists.
that's a little bit more obvious.
And I think what the last almost 2 years now has revealed is 30-ish% in my congregation, they have no need for the church or the pastor whatsoever. And
Isn't there actually like a philosophical or legal rule about this? The 30-30 rule?
yeah,
I think so.
yeah.
This is pretty typical of any group.
Well, I use the 3 to 5% rule, the tipping point. Any group
The 70,
that loses.
oh yeah, look at that. The 70-30 rule for small group leaders.
You're welcome.
30% do most of the work.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
That's bright. 3 out of 10. And that's what I discovered, and you did too, is about 30% of your congregation, it's just convenient to go to church. And then when they were told don't go to church anymore because of these reasons, they didn't. And some of them found their way back eventually, but they behave as if the last 18 months didn't happen, by and large. Then you have the other 70%, but I would break that off into pieces too and say within that, you have another 30% who are your diehards.
Right.
Like that fraction reveals. And so you have 30 that they're just there because it's a part of their week and they've always done it. So they just show up. They don't really believe what you believe. They don't believe most of the confession that you make. They believe in God. They believe that Jesus did what he did and he's important. He's God. They can't really tell you the details.
Historic sense, right?
Yeah. And they read the Bible. I shouldn't say they don't read the Bible. When you read the Bible to them in church, they listen for the moral teaching and what will help them either emotionally let down their burden for a moment or morally lead them out of the church back into their lives.
Right.
And then you have the squishy middle, which are just good-hearted people. They believe. They're relatively naive to the truth because they don't read the Bible. They don't read the catechism. They don't read the Lutheran confessions. But they support you as their pastor. They respect you. They respect the office. They come regularly to church, to the service, and they are big supporters of, Sunday school, confirmation, other programs at the church. They're just so busy in their own lives with their vocations that they don't prioritize reading the Bible, praying, devotions, that kind of thing.
Yeah, but we've all been there, and I think we understand that.
Right.
Maybe, I don't know about you, but at least myself, maybe I'm not great about communicating that. I found that people are most encouraged when I talk about, like my family hasn't always prayed together, and we struggled with that even growing up, and now with my own children, and it's taken. Frankly, I was ashamed. I was ashamed of my another pastor, and for whatever reason, the Spirit took hold of that, and it clicked, and like, okay, no, we can make a change here. Just be intentional about it.
We have to schedule it. That's how that works.
That's what we did too. Yeah, it requires a discipline. It's like
the larger your family, the more things seem to unravel quickly. The best laid plans.
Well, and here's the reality of it, and this is another chapter in the book, but we're not going to read today. But when we get to the book here, the nature of our family, we both structured our families now around the ability, actually, to be a community. A commune, if you want.
Right.
Where God's word can be a part of that day, because we are all home at the same time. Otherwise you really can't pull it off.
Yeah,
not in an intentional way. Not
I
together.
think now more than at any time in our lives, and possibly in the last 5 or 6 generations, now more than ever, the importance of leaning into that tribal identity, that familial clan identity, is more important than ever.
Absolutely. Because
essentially what you're doing at a certain point is you're just giving your children away to indoctrination that you have no control over. And I'm not speaking in just one way derogatorily towards people that send their kids for compulsory education. I mean both ways. Even if you support the school system and you're in favor of your school district's curriculum, you're ceding that authority that God gave to you as a parent to strangers.
Right. Well, I've struggled against that even here with the Lutheran day school. In this context, because it's still the same challenge. Is that the primary, if you like, role model, the primary example for the child of living in the faith is their parent, not their school teacher or their pastor.
And I think a lot of what we see in regards to Sunday school and confirmation, we also see in relation to schools, whether it's compulsory or the Lutheran day school, which is the parents turn them over to you and say, here, teach them. Well, but they see their parents not invested in and engaging with them in the educational process.
Right. It's a rite and a ritual in search of a meaning.
Yes. Yeah.
Right. We're looking for it to do something, but we don't have a promise attached to it.
Right.
Right. And even the Christian day school, the only promise we have is train the child in the way they should go, and they won't depart from it. But that was a promise given to the father. And that doesn't mean the father can't, see that authority to another in an assisting kind of role, but not in a primary role. I got into this. Why was it? I've had a number of pastors, because I've been posting about this on Facebook, so apparently the pastors like Nanny are on Facebook. Anyway, so they reach out to me and they're like, one is like fighting their own Lutheran school board, basically. about masking their kids. And you're like, so a Lutheran school is having problems with parents asserting their responsibility over their children.
Yes.
It's pretty incredible, right? And
Yeah.
I've had multiple have this. I have a pastor who resigned temporarily or just said, I'm not going to serve you until you'll let me be your pastor again. So
Sure.
they don't even recognize the office of the ministry. So maybe it's an authority crisis. Maybe that's part of it.
Let me add to it in this way. The other day on my other podcast, I was talking about the warrior archetype and the warrior ethos as a discipline. And what was discussed was that the ethos, the discipline of the warrior, which is made up of brotherhood and integrity and a strong sense of justice and so on, that can quickly become brutal and aggressive and cruel without a moral basis or without a moral boundary around it. So, for example, then when King Porus confronts Alexander the Great in India and says, listen, you're not a king, you're a conqueror. Because every land that you've gone through, from Egypt to Persia, through Afghanistan into India, what do? You conquer the person that is in power. You take all of the treasures of that country. You turn the country back over to their former oppressor, the prince, who's now your vassal lord. And you leave the country worse off than when you came into it. You're not a liberator, and you're not a king, because what are you king of? You're not. You're a conqueror. You go, you rape the land, you take the treasure, you kill the people, you put them back under the authority of this person that you just said you liberated them from, and you keep marching forward. And the reason is you have no moral basis for what you're doing. You're not a moral person, he says. You're a savage. And your soldiers are a savage as a consequence, because you haven't established a moral kind of horizon line for them to function from. So then what happens is, in relation to then this conversation that we're having, is what I think is happening is that the parents, they have no moral basis from which they're working. It's, again, just either like not ritual. Like,
this is what we do.
This is what we do. Or, like you said, a radical rejection of authority. You can't tell me what to do. You can't tell us what to do. We pay your check, which again is the lack of any kind of like moral boundaries of what is good, what's virtuous, what's just,
right,
what's charitable. Because you're not saying, like, how do we take care of our pastor? Or we better take a step back and detach and really look at our philosophy as a school, because the parents' primary vocation is this. And
we're
saying,
here
no,
to
it's
support
ours.
and encourage them in that vocation.
Right. And to me, that's a lack of moral foundation.
I think that makes sense. And that goes all the way back around full circle to what you're saying about, people with their own realities that don't necessarily represent the truth, the subjective reality, is that you can only get to that point if you don't have an objective truth or moral basis, for how you live, right? Standards, if you want to just say that.
Right. Well, and that's what I run into quite often when I have this conversation about the congregation taking care of the parsonage, taking care of myself and my family, taking care of the cemetery, taking care of their own church building. When I start talking in moral terms, they have no idea what I'm talking about. Or if they do have an idea, they just don't see it as relevant to the conversation, because they function primarily from feelings.
Right. And
we feel like we're doing the right thing.
Right. And I've had to, out of necessity, kind of adjust the way we do governance here to allow people to basically do the things that make them feel good. Because they're not going to commit to doing things that are difficult, burdensome, or torturous even.
Right. At the end of the day, based on this actual conversation, because I've been formulating it for years now in my ministry, I actually don't have any hope for American churches. I have hope for the church, because I know that God will save his body.
You actually have a word of promise on that. Yeah.
I have a word of promise. But as far as the American churches go, I don't foresee the American churches surviving.
Not as they're currently oriented or structured. Yeah.
Well, they're not hungry for the gospel of Jesus Christ. They're definitely not hungry for the sacraments. And from that, the fruits of their faith are severely lacking, because, like I said, there's no moral foundation. There's no sense of integrity, justice, charity, forgiveness, brotherhood.
Yeah.
Like, those are all severely wanting.
But arguably, I
see it in our Christian institutions.
That's part of the cyclical structure of, any human institution.
Yes.
They do well, and especially the church. Like we said, we've said this before. Just read read the book of Chronicles. That was last episode, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
go back and read Chronicles. And the chronicler is very careful to just show you this is a regular cycle. It happens over and over. It's
Right.
not to say you just surrender yourself to it. You can fight against the dying of the light. But ultimately,
That's all you can do.
That's all you can do, right?
It's like I've said before, you have two choices, because the end state of every person that is or ever was or ever will be is death. That's the end state of the old Adam, is death, and then the promise of resurrection. So you can either fight and die, or you can surrender and die, but those are your only two choices.
But surrender and die, that's the action of the unbeliever.
Correct. Sit down, give up, put whatever you need to put into your mouth to sustain your existence for the rest of today, and then do the same thing tomorrow and do it every day until you die. That's what it means to surrender.
Well,
Or you can fight.
We've talked about this with the nature of the hymnody in the church, and that the church militant section is it's only a favorite like at Reformation time, and then the rest of the year it kind of falls by the wayside. And it's like, well, why have you given up the fight? Because it's actually the fight that's the testimony of faithfulness.
Right. Well, we can use this to segue into the readings, but I see this with political pundits, for example, that for them it's such a game, talking politics and the ideology of politics and complaining about.
Oh, you mean like One American News being funded by AT&T, the same people who fund CNN?
On CNN, that too.
They play both sides? What?
Yeah. But I mean in the sense of the way that pundits talk and the way in which it's almost a game with them, and there's rules to the game and they're playing the game and it gets them excited like they're playing a game. Whereas for the rest of us, it's a matter of survival. And the pundits to me impress me as the type of people who will argue about the Senate's vote on the latest tax referendum while the city burns.
Yeah. So it's live action role playing.
Yeah. They're LARPing. Yeah, exactly. That's what pundits are LARPing. And you see that in any institution. There are those who are pundits for the institution. They're LARPers. They're going to fiddle while Rome burns. And
what's the evidence? I think you're right about the political pundit, and you can
the
apply
fact that
this
they
to the church.
Do nothing. They offer no plan. No,
I wouldn't say
mission.
they do nothing. It's that the things they do aren't actually...
No, I'm saying they do nothing in relation to the plan. They offer no plan, no solution. They're like race baiters or race hustlers.
Right. They don't
race hustlers complain about race, but offer no way forward, no mission.
Right. There's no action. And the action or the action's irrelevant.
Right. And I don't, whoever your favorite political pundit is, conservative or liberal, just listen sometime and wait for them to offer you a path forward, a mission statement.
Here's the phone number. Call this phone number. Talk to your senator. Yeah.
No, I mean more than that. I mean a call to action. Like, this is what I believe we need to do to stop this from continuing to happen.
Right. But my point was that's still not far enough. You have to say, here's the person in contact. Here's how we're organizing. Here's when we meet.
That's what I'm saying. Exactly. You need to act. And most pundits, just like race hustlers, they complain and they point the finger and they light the fire, and then they step back and watch it burn rather than say, how can we prevent these fires from ever happening again? This is what we need to do. They don't do that. They just complain, and then they say, well, you got to vote.
Well, I wouldn't even say, well, here's what we need to do. Here's what we're doing.
Yeah, sure.
Just
no,
take
that's a
it
better
all
way
the
to
way.
say it, sure. Yeah.
Yeah. It's like,
because what we need to do is still complaining without doing something a lot
I think
of times.
so. I think so. And I if you want to live action role play, I mean, I guess you're free to do that. And I think last year when we got pretty heavy in the weeds, we kind of, with politics, well, because of the oppressive nature of it under COVID, I would say, well, I'm just going to take this up as my hobby, and I'm not going to pay attention to professional sports. At least that's what I told my wife. Right. And but it got fatiguing after a while, because like professional sports, it's like it's
the eternal reoccurrence of the same. It's just repetition after repetition. It's like, again, I live in Minnesota.
Oh, you mean seasons? Yes, exactly.
Well, that too, but I was going to say, I used to be a Minnesota sports fan up until like 10 years ago or so. And being a Minnesota sports fan means that you get used to mediocrity, because all of our sports teams are at best mediocre.
Even the sports venues are mediocre.
And even the sports venues are mediocre.
Yeah.
And everybody in the state fools themselves. This is going to be the year. It's like, no, it's not. They're going to make it to the first round of the playoffs and lose, because that's what they always do. They're holding the football. You run up like Charlie Brown to kick it. They yank it out and you land on your back. And then you're going to come back next year and do it again because you're fools. You're willfully ignorant to the truth. We do the same thing with politics. We do the same thing with schools. We pretend year after year after year. Nope, this year is going to be different. This time it's going to be better.
Right. But we've done nothing to actually affect that result
Correct.
that we're looking for.
Right. Because we're not interested in the truth. And we vilify people who tell us the truth.
Team
We want to
sport.
be patronized. We want to be patronized.
Patronize,
That's why, yeah.
good. Yeah.
So cherish truth-telling, but be prudent. Cherish truth-telling, but be prudent about it. Page 105 of
Yo, we're
Live Not by
skipping all the way
Lies.
to there. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
We're not going to do doublethink and free speech?
Was that
I
back
was going
in
to start at 100. page
reject
100.
doublethink and free speech?
No, I was
103?
going back even farther. Choose a life apart from the crowd.
Oh, look at you. All right, we can do that. You're in charge. I'm just along for the ride.
Okay. I'm not usually in charge. I kind of took charge with this book.
There we go.
Okay. There we go.
So choose a life apart from the crowd, page 100 of Live Not by Lies, a manual for Christian dissidents by Rod Dreher. I am sitting at the luncheon table of Father Kirill Kaleda inside the toasty, warm wooden building that serves as his office. A late autumn snow fell outside over the Butovo firing range, the field in the forested far southern regions of Moscow, where in a 14-month period between 1937 and 1938, agents of the NKVD, short for the secret police, executed about 21,000 political prisoners.
Shoosh.
They executed 21,000 people in 14 months.
What's
How many
the math
people is
on
that a month? Exactly. I need my son here.
21,000 divided by 14. That's 1,500 a month. So how many per day?
That's crazy.
50 a day.
Dang. Thanks to the advocacy work of Father Kirill, the field is now a national monument to the dead. On the day I visited, Russian citizens gathered outside in the cold to solemnly read aloud the names of each murdered countryman, to honor their memories, and to remember what Soviet totalitarianism had done to them. I wonder if we're going to do that in... I think we're going to do that in 50 years for all those who died from the vaccine.
I can't read Cyrillic. I'm trying to...
Right.
It's the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. And that's the English translation.
That's amazing.
I can't even read the phonetic.
Right.
I'm no good at this.
That's
Let's see.
okay.
If I say services, how do I make this speech it? Speech it to me. Speech. How do I make this read it? It's not reading it for me. Anyway, 1517, it was the Tsarist police that was set up under the
Right.
provisional government. And look, it was a provisional thing, and guess what happened?
It became permanent?
How does that happen?
That's so weird. Why would a government do that?
I posted this on Facebook, since the founding of the United States of America, only 350 institutions that were founded by the federal government have been dissolved. 350. And there's
Kinda
currently
like the federal income tax.
there's something like 3,500 organizations that compose the federal government.
Monstrous.
Isn't that something?
Yeah.
It is. Well, that's the thing. So as soon as you say, well, let's create a commission, then you just have to be willing to accept that it's going to be there forever.
Yeah.
I think that's true of every institution, though. I don't think it's just the federal government.
No, it's the nature of the institution. It's got to justify its existence.
So once you create the committee or the board or whatever,
Right.
now you've got a committee or a board.
Well, it's like I've said before, every institution's monstrous and it requires human sacrifices to feed. And so why not create even more opportunities for more human sacrifice so that it can feed in ever greater numbers to satisfy its ever-growing hunger?
What is this going back and forth in our chat about WIS score and saves?
I don't know.
Okay, these people know what they're talking about. Paul and Chad, you guys talk amongst yourselves. That's fine.
How does an honest man live under totalitarianism? I ask the priest, a broad-shouldered man with a thick brown beard and piercing eyes. With difficulty, he says, laughing. Of course it's difficult. But thanks be to God, there were people who were doing their best to build their lives in such a way that they could live in truth. People understand that if that was going to be a priority to live in truth, then they were going to have to limit themselves in other ways. The progress of their careers, for example. But they made a choice and resolved to live by it. Yeah.
Yep.
That pretty much sums up our lives the last 18, 19 months.
It's a great paragraph. I mean, because this is the wisdom of somebody who went through it.
Yeah.
They say, how do you do it? Well, you just do it intentionally.
Yeah. I think it goes to the point, though, too, when I listen to people talk about people that I interface with who are special ops people, either current or previous, they always usually say the same thing, which is, I knew from a very young age that I wanted to grow up and go into special operations, Ranger, SEAL, whatever it might be. It was a calling for them. And when they describe it, the way that they talk about it is it was a calling. And when I was in training and I was going through it, there was never an option to quit for me. It wasn't an option. I never thought about it. No matter how bad it got, I never said to myself, I need to rethink my priorities. I need to rethink my choices here. Maybe I don't belong here.
Well,
that was never an option.
Where it's actually the commander sometimes, like in training, will say, or will actually kick them out because they won't quit.
Right.
And they're going to kill themselves if they keep going.
Right. The fact that I knew that WIS is wisdom in D&D because I played it for, almost 2 decades. I thought you were talking about Wisconsin for some reason.
I saw Wisconsin too.
Just goes to
so their wisdom score of the characters LARPing is woefully low. That was the whole context.
I got it. That was almost like a Community reference or a Rick and Morty reference at that point.
Well, you know that Harmontown with the whole live
the
D&D.
documentary. Yep.
Well, it wasn't a documentary. It was a podcast.
No, I'm saying they made a documentary about him before that happened. Yeah.
Correct. Yes.
Which is fascinating because he's a
wow, what a messy
he's a
guy.
character. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Father Kirill grew up in an Orthodox Christian family with 6 children. None joined the Communist Youth League, the Komsomol. Oh yeah, back to my point. They have a calling. They know it's a calling. They never really feel like they ever had a choice. It was just, this is the trajectory of my life.
Yes.
And I think going to the paragraph, that's where you get to, like you and I got to last March, which was everything that we had on the back burner for, well, probably since we were in high school, came to the foreground. And and all of a sudden we were confronted with, you've been right this whole time. And now you're not considered crazy because everyone's talking about what you've been talking about for a long time. And no one's laughing at you anymore. And I tell people the same thing. It's not like I pursue these avenues of research or thought because I have a lot of free time to waste on these things, or it gives me a sense of, I don't know, joy or glee to know these things. It's just, I've always been drawn in that direction. And it's the same thing with when we talk about being contradictory in nature. Like, I don't choose to be a contrarian. I just am wired that way. If the crowd's running one way, I start walking the other direction.
Right. You see yourself as like a counterweight or a counterbalance.
Not even that. I don't think about it. That's just what I am. That's how I function. It's the way I've always been.
Well, it's like our first home birth doctor said to us. He was asking like about whether we wanted to do this or that to the baby after they were born. And we're like, no. He's like, wow, you really are hardcore non-interventionalists. It's like, yeah, no, that's about right.
Yeah.
No, we're just going to let
you didn't wake up that way and just one day decide, you know what, we're going to change and we're going to be this instead of that. No, you've always been that way. It's just that through cultivation and nurturing and forces outside of your control, here you are.
Yeah.
You didn't marry Anne because all of a sudden she appeared to you like a vision and said, follow me and I will enlighten you and you will be this different person. You were attracted to her the same reason that I was attracted to Annie, which is personality-wise, thought-wise, doctrinally, they were at least traveling in a parallel path to you.
Yeah. Well, she was the odd one out, actually.
Right. And so when you start saying the things that you say and you're used to the response being, you're kidding, right? You don't actually believe that. When you talk to them, they're like, oh, okay, I can see that.
Well, it's worse than that. Other people didn't even understand what you were talking about. You're talking on a totally different plane, different level, or just about subjects that they don't even care about.
Right.
Or know about.
To the present tense.
Yeah, that's still pretty much true. Yeah.
But to those who think that somehow folks like us are purposefully subjectively anti-authoritarian or anti-institutional, no. It's just a part of your makeup, and then events come along that either push you one way or the other way. Because coming out of atheism for myself and coming into the Lutheran Church by way of the catechisms, for example, I have a very emotional attachment to the catechisms because they were the tipping point for me of like, oh, okay, this is what I'm going to do now. Because when I read Luther, I was like, I know this guy. I know him. I understand what he's saying. I get this.
Oh.
And the more I read Luther and the more I pursued that study of him, the more I realized, oh, we can be best friends. Like, I get you.
I was going to suggest, I mean, our journeys are very different. And yet I think you're right about, the catechism was like the only thing about the institutional church that made sense to me.
Sure. Yeah.
I mean, a lot of the things we were saying and doing didn't really drag, and the things that the catechism teaches. So like baptism, for example, I mean, really made sense, but, by faith. But a lot of the rest of the institutional church was like, what is this? And I thought I could fix it. So I'm maybe not as contrarian, but.
I think we all go through that, though.
Yeah.
I think it's a part of it is looking at the institution from the outside and saying, I don't want to be a part of it. I don't want to join it, but I can fix it.
Well, I don't want to be a part of it unless I'm doing something about it. Yeah.
Yeah. Which can shipwreck you very quickly if you don't catch yourself.
Yes. Or
we were talking about
after
that before you hit record.
You find a new ship. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you literally crash against these institutional rocks like a pinball. You're like, oh, I crashed against this one. I'll go over here and fix this one. And you crash at that one, and you just keep going from church to church, building to building.
You mean like the pirates did, where they run the ship into the other ship and then take over the ship that they ran into? Yeah.
Yeah, but we just sink, and then we jump on that ship, and we're like, we can fix this by running it into that ship over there. And eventually you realize these people don't want to change directions. They don't want to sail in a different direction. They're the ones who call the NKVD and say, hey, my neighbor is farming more land than he's been allotted. Or my neighbor has an extra cow. Or I saw my neighbor coming on to church the other day. He was talking to the priest about something when no one was around. Because why? Because we want everything to be normal. And the way for things to remain normal is for us to inform on our neighbors who are not behaving normally.
Oh, you mean conforming, right?
Yeah.
Not being conformed to the image of the Son of God, but rather conformed to the image of the state.
Correct. So he says, when I was a teenager, I wanted to study history. My father explained to me that in the Soviet world, trying to be involved with history and not be involved with Soviet ideology is impossible. It's like if somebody were writing in code about the United States right now, this would be the essay.
Well, the playbook's the same.
It is. It's always
context is different. Yeah.
So he says, I became a geologist. Lots of anti-Bolshevik families sent their kids to study the natural sciences to avoid contamination with the ideology as much as possible.
I bet you there's white supremacy in the natural sciences now too.
Actually, I heard a great term this morning. I'm going to ride it till it dies. Woke supremacy.
Ooh.
Yeah. Because a certain person shot up a school and killed somebody and got out of jail on $75,000 bail.
Was it? Was it even 75? I thought it was like 25. It was even lower.
Was it after everything was said and done? Versus old Kyle there in Wisconsin. That was $2 million.
Right, exactly. And was locked up for months, not days.
So yeah, woke supremacy, I think, is a great term that we have to use.
I saw another one. It was, Derek Chauvin from your neck of the woods.
Oh, I'm very familiar.
He's appealing, of course.
Yep.
And they won't give him a public defender.
Right.
But when the Boston bomber appealed, he got 6 public defenders.
Correct. Right.
Like, oh, well, yeah. What's the difference between the two?
Well, I told you last week, you have to accept at a certain point that America is a land of laws, but no justice.
Mm-hmm. Well, the laws they just are not uniformly applied.
That's what I'm saying. That's why there's no justice, because there's no equity.
It's a tool. Yeah.
It's a tool. And right now
Political
it's a tool. Well, it's always been a tool of tyranny, depending on what group you're in.
Somebody was asking me, like, well, how is it that judges can be partisan? I'm like, judges were always partisan.
They've always been partisan. That's why they're chosen.
They were supposed, to set their partisanship aside, right?
That's impossible.
There is no, what you're saying, it's justice is impossible?
Yeah.
I don't disagree.
Yeah.
I mean, we seek it, but we don't ever, it's never
it's an uncomfortable
applied.
truth of history, but as someone I know pointed out yesterday, the reason that poor people don't rise up and start an armed revolution in this country is because poor people recognize that our life means nothing to these people that control law enforcement and the military.
Right.
It's just that simple. Our life means next to nothing to them, which is why they're experimenting on us.
Or on your children.
And on my children.
Which
Nobody in the White
of,
House has to be vaccinated.
Right.
Nobody
That
at
is
the
a form
federal level.
of child abuse, non-consensual. Yeah.
Yeah. So we'll just test this experimental RNA serum out on the poor and anyone foolish enough to participate in it who's at our level.
Well, we'll give them economic incentive actually to subject themselves to the experiment.
Like donuts and free beer and then money. And if that doesn't work, we'll fine them.
Or a job. Yeah, we're limiting their employability.
Yeah. So you want to avoid contamination with the ideology as much as possible.
Well, and so the church isn't immune, obviously, because the invasion of the woke ideology is in our churches, even the ones so-called conservative ones.
Yeah. Well, the church as an institution, as we learned last week, because we received an email from our Synod president about this, and I won't make any judgments either way about it. Let people decide for themselves what they think the content of the email indicates for our church body as a whole. But what you see from other church bodies, the Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, is, no, you're going to do this. You don't get a choice. You don't get an exemption. You're going to do this because it's the right thing to do. It's how you love your neighbor. It's how you serve God.
The moral committee in the Vatican, they've ruled.
Correct.
That it's safe, effective, and it's good for you and good for your neighbor.
Right. I published a list of questions that you are to ask if you so desire in our Telegram group. They're formulated by a lawyer, a smart lawyer, and it's just a series of questions that you can ask your employer, your pastor, priest, whoever it might be. And I think it's a great litmus test. Just ask questions. That's all. Don't argue with people. Don't fight them. Don't make assertions and get in their face. Don't start screaming at them or cuss them out. Just ask them the questions.
Right.
And if they can't answer the questions, ask them, then why are you pushing this on me?
Is it being contrarian? Maybe a little bit, but I think it's being subversive too. But that's not necessarily a negative virtue. I think of like the way that Nathan brought David to repentance. Right? Sure. He's very subversive. It's it's kind of a backdoor, side door kind of thing. Tells him a story and just says, well, what do you think should happen to the guy? Well, he should die. Oh yeah, by the way, that's you. Oh, right. And it's just like get the employers thinking about like what am I actually asking my employee to do? But they haven't probably thought even on that level. They're just like, oh, there's a mandate and there's an expectation. I'm just going to do the thing and there's no harm, no foul. And you're like, until the employee says to them, have you thought about the implications of this? And you do that in that subversive way with just questions. It's like, so, do you know what's in the vaccine? Can you tell me?
Right. Well, and you posted that video Telegram this morning too about the history of how the federal government has experimented on black people.
Yeah, minority in particular.
And it goes back to this paragraph on the study of history. I think if you are either formally trained in history, as I am, or you're a hobbyist, or just it's your passion to study and learn from history, you are without doubt the one person that can't be at the dinner party. Because as he notes, you're the one who's going to bring this stuff up and make everything uncomfortable.
Of course.
Well, I just don't understand why this group of people won't just submit to this. And it's like, do you know the history of the treatment of these people by the government? Well, what do you mean? And then you list it, and it's like, well, I just don't believe that would happen.
What's the key distinction between these folks and between the majority of people today? Is that they have a common culture that they actually hold to, right? It's a culture that transcends their their political ideology.
Correct.
And thus it has cultural values that can actually bring criticism upon politics, ethics, economics, other things, right? And say, yeah. I mean, whether it's slavery, go way back, or like you talked about the experimentation, medically. I brought that up. Wasn't that the statue they took down in Central Park, the gynecologist?
The gynecologist, yeah, the father of modern gynecology,
who did it through experimenting on slaves.
Yeah,
black slaves. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's one way to figure things out, I suppose.
Yeah. It's weird that if you look at the history of how we've treated the native peoples and the way that we treated black people, forced sterilization through vaccinations was in both their histories more than one time.
And they haven't forgotten. And that's why I brought up that
we did
that common culture.
Right.
As soon as you forfeit, an ethnic or some other kind of cultural basis, I suppose it's usually ethnic.
Right.
You lose the kind of, or even like a family ethic or a tribal ethic, right?
Exactly. Tribal memory is longer than the globalist memory because the tribal memory is simply, it's microcosmic. It's just this group. And we
Right,
need to
right.
remember the struggle of this group versus a globalist perspective, which is, well, we're all in this together, which obviously is a lie because that's billions of people. And second of all, you're basically glossing over the fact that every group within every country, within every tribal region, has a multitude of histories and a multitude of memories that you're simply whitewashing to formulate one collective memory that you're saying, this is our memory.
Right. Well, and that's what
And
God
right
has
now
Moses.
it's COVID, and in a couple of years it's going to be climate crisis.
This is what God has Moses do. It's like, here's the song. Teach the people this song. This is the song they're to sing, the song of deliverance, right?
Right. Yeah.
From Egypt, through the Red Sea. And then, not that long after, going in the Promised Land and intermarrying and whatnot, they don't even remember the song anymore.
Exactly.
They've lost their tribal identity, and then they just get pushed about by whatever winds and waves of doctrine come along, false gods, etc. Because they've lost that. And I guess that's the point. Is like when you lose that common culture, just put it that way, especially we would say as Christians, the one that God gives, then you easily forget and you get
Well,
deceived.
we have that even within the institution that we work for, 1517. You have a different set of tribes. We have a Dallas group that does most of the conference production side of things. They're all geographically close enough to each other that they can meet regularly. They have, we call it like a clique, but it's more like a tribal identity, a group identity. And then you have the Irvine group that's kind of dispersed now. You have some in Northern California. Adam has moved to Chicago. But that Irvine identity, that Rod, the students of Rod,
the original identity, ultimately.
the Irvine identity, that's kind of their tribe. And so when they get together at conferences, they kind of form around a table together as a group, and the Dallas group forms around a table as a group. And then you have different smaller groups like the Ringside with the Preacher guys who all went through seminary together and they're friends with each other. Each one of these groups has its own collective identity as a clan or a tribe.
And
values.
Yeah.
And values. And then, but broadly speaking, we all function under the umbrella of this institution called 1517. And it's non-geographic too, which adds to that separation of clans into these different groups. And so everybody's doing their own thing within their clans. And like you said, they have their own values, they have their own language, they have their own traditions and customs. And then you try and put that all together and make it work. And sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. That's the nature of every institution, though. And then the bigger the institution, the more washed out the values, the morals, the identity is going to become. Which, if you want to control a mass group of people, perfect. That's great.
Right.
But if you want to form a common identity that we can all share, it's not good for that.
Well, that's why I think, our synodical president's letter is exactly what I would have expected,
Right.
Because it was politically expedient to say something, but to not really be all that definitive at all, because you're looking at a church body. I mean, like even the churches of my county.
Correct.
There's not a lot of harmony on that matter of COVID. There's varying opinions about practice, especially, but even reality. What is it and what's going on?
And I think the only difference, let's go back to the Black Plague.
Sure.
As an example, an actual epidemic. Now,
empirically,
yes, is that what you didn't have was social media and mass telecommunications. So that you go back to the Black Death, the Black Plague, I guarantee you, based on just Luther's letters, I'm staying. If you want to run away, but I'm staying. We already know, even with the plagues in Wittenberg, and then going back to the Black Plague before that, there were some priests who were saying, if you leave the city to flee the plague, you have no faith. And then others saying, if you don't leave the city to care for those members who are fleeing, you're not in the vocation of your ministry, properly speaking. And then the church body is saying one or the other. But because you have parishes as far away as Great Britain and Ireland from Rome, and then going the other direction to Moscow, St. Petersburg, and so forth, what do you have? You have this washed out, broad swath of geography with people that can't communicate with each other. It takes days or months for a letter to reach the next church where your brother priest is serving. You could basically believe and practice anything you wanted because there wasn't a lot of, again, the further away from Rome you went, that was that. The less contact you had with the papacy, the more free you were to kind of make it up as you went.
Right.
Whereas nowadays, even if I have a Lutheran in Rome and a Lutheran in St. Petersburg and a Lutheran in Dublin and a Lutheran here in Webster, we can all communicate with each other in real time and argue over what we agree and disagree on, and we're still going to leave the conversation and do whatever we think is right for our congregation, regardless of what the church body president or anybody else says. So I don't think anything's changed. I just think that the means by which we communicate has changed.
Right, but I guess to the point of the paragraph, I mean, we are. This is how we found a way to live in effectively a Soviet world without becoming Soviet ourselves.
Right.
If you want to apply it that way.
Well, and then here we go. Then, refusing to join the Komsomol meant that he would not be permitted to travel abroad.
Yes, we know. Okay, keep going.
I'm sorry. Just wanted to let that hang in the air for a second. Once as a student, Father Kirill was offered an exciting ship voyage from Vladivostok on the Soviet East Coast down to Australia, Singapore, up through the Suez Canal and back home through the Black Sea. It was a dream come true. But he would have to be a Komsomol member to take the trip. Rather than violate his conscience, Kirill declined and proposed a Komsomol friend in his place. The sea journey changed his friend's life. Oh, it's sad.
Yeah, that would have been quite a trip.
It's so true. It's just, yeah.
Yeah, but so what? I mean, so you didn't get to see the world.
No, it's tragic that that's for something so petty.
Right, but the petty is that's the thing that's easiest to control.
It is because you're appealing to the basest desires and emotions of a person.
I mean, what you're going to find is the hardest thing to control is something like childbearing, right?
Correct.
I know the Chinese have done it, but only through great terror.
Have they? How many people how many people in rural China do you think are raising children that they didn't give birth to? I bet you it's a lot.
Yeah. Well, yeah, rural China. Yeah. We're
Not
talking
in
about
big
the
cities.
cities.
You can't get away with it in the big cities necessarily, but
because everybody's watching. Yeah.
right. But it goes to the point of conscience too, though, because we've talked about this, but we haven't talked about it for a while, so let's talk about it.
Well, conscience.
Pre-modern.
Yes, exactly. Okay.
Pre-modern definition of conscience is your sense of standing in relation to God and your neighbor. It's a relational term. Postmodern, since the Enlightenment, conscience is an angel on one shoulder and a devil on the other. It's Jiminy Cricket, your conscience. Let your conscience be your guide.
Good versus
one
evil.
is outside of yourself, and the other takes place entirely inside yourself. So when Dr. Luther, for example, talks about conscience, he means, what does God think of you? What does your neighbor think of you?
How's this going to affect those relationships? Yeah.
Yeah, how does it affect the relationship that you have with God and your neighbor? Versus in the modern world, post-Enlightenment, it's all going on internally, inside each individual person.
Right.
Which becomes, I become my own moral compass. That's literally the definition of autonomy, a self-law.
Right. Well, and this is why we rebel against, say, the Ten Commandments, because we see it as moral obligation in terms of a legal scheme, of merit and whatnot. That's all Western thought. Whereas, what the scriptures give, I would argue, is like here's what looks lovely within this relationship. Right. It's a moral standard, a framework for the relationship between God and man, and between you and your neighbor.
Right.
And it shows you what's good. Yeah, we rebel against it, and yes, we don't follow it, and it shows us that too. Of course, that's the chief use, we would say.
Right.
But it still shows you, like, this is, if you like, the Edenic life, of man with God and with one another. And what the things to strive for, the things to work for, the things to fight for.
Right. What you said, I think, is incredibly important. Probably one of the most important things that we've ever talked about on the podcast. Excuse me. So for those of you listening, pay attention to this. That in the present tense, when we read the Ten Commandments, we hear the law preached, we only think about ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And how this affects me personally. Pre-modern, what you would have heard was, how does this affect my relationship to God and to my neighbor? So you're basically in the present tense asking, what's my relationship to myself? And therefore, what's my relationship to God? Versus pre-modern, which is, well, what does God think of me in relation to the law? What does my neighbor think of me in relation to the law?
Mm-hmm.
This is, like I said, probably one of the most important things that we discussed on this show, because it changes everything. It changes the nature of how you understand the law and the gospel.
Mm-hmm.
Because then the gospel sets you free to do what? Well, it sets you free to be in a clearer, more sober relationship to yourself and your own personal morality Versus for Luther, the gospel sets you free to be for God and for your neighbor.
Right.
It's entirely opposite of what the original intent of the law was given for.
Right. And we talk about the will, it's attached then to the will.
Correct.
We're enslaved or bound to the selfish will.
Right.
That's what sin is. To not live in faith toward God or love toward your neighbor. And that's what the gospel does. It actually breaks that enslavement. But it binds you in a different way, right? Rather than binding yourself, being bound to your sinful will, you're actually, that relationship to God and to your neighbor is restored. Which is a kind of slavery, right? We're a slave to the law of Christ,
right?
Which is, it's a master and what do you want to say, apprentice relationship? I don't know.
Well, think of it this way, using again same setup. So in Romans, Paul says that Jesus Christ is the termination of the law for all those who have faith. He is the end of the law. In relation to God and in relation to your neighbor, Jesus is the termination of the law, because you are free to be for God and for your neighbor. You don't need the law, because you are in relation to God and your neighbor. They will determine for you what is necessary. But Jesus can't be the termination of the law if you're in relationship to yourself, because now you're cut loose from any sort of boundaries, any sort of rule, any sort of order whatsoever. So you must have Jesus lead you back to a better understanding of the law, which will lead you to a better understanding of yourself.
Right. Rather than it work the other direction, where the first principle is what is lovely for myself, and then that's what love for my neighbor is going to look like.
Correct.
Which, it's how you could take the greatest commandment. You could read it that way, right? To say, love your neighbor as yourself, meaning, how do I want to love myself? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right?
Yeah.
Which, that's true. That's not a bad, obviously it's straight out of the scripture. But you're not listening. You're not listening to God, and you're not listening to your neighbor.
Right.
And you're presuming that your heart is always going to be oriented towards what's good for you, first and foremost, which isn't true, and what's good for your neighbor, which you don't even know what it is because you don't want to listen to them.
Because you're only wrapped up in yourself, which leads us back to the beginning of the conversation about the day school conversation, which is you have no collective morality. You have no objective moral basis, because you're all autonomous. You all believe you're autonomous selves. And therefore, when you do hear the law, whether it be civil law or the spiritual law, you hear the law in relation to yourself. And you need that rule set to guide you in order to be a good person, a moral person, versus hearing the law and being set free from the law by Jesus through faith, so that you are now free to let the others say to you, this is what I need from you. This is how I need you to serve me. So rather than listen to the parent whose primary vocation is caretaker of the child, the person on the school board, for example, only hears that in relation to themselves and how this affects themselves. Not the students, not the parents, not the church or the community as a whole, but themselves. As individuals.
The parent might be wrong, and your role there may be to call them to repentance.
Sure.
Right. But I think that's the key, because if we're talking secular school, this doesn't apply at all. But like in a Christian school, or in my case, a Lutheran day school, the only way that any of this works or makes any sense is if the school itself hasn't been decoupled from God's word.
Right.
And then we do all.
Yeah.
If all things must be done under, subjection to Christ. If it's not, if the conversation with the parent is like, I'm the expert teacher and you are, the stupid parent, well, it's never going to work. The parent's not going to listen to you if that's the position, the attitude you take.
Which is why when I say pastorally, start from Jesus crucified for the sin of the world and work your way out from there, they automatically default to the law, because they don't know what I'm talking about. And they have no idea how to start from Jesus crucified for the sin of the world. They only know how to start with the law as it relates to themselves.
Yeah. This is a topic that probably we're going to have to keep teasing out for a while.
Yeah.
So I imagine it's kind of revolutionary for folks.
So
it's counterintuitive. Yeah.
Yeah.
We'll put it that way.
To this day, that friend does a lot of traveling across seas and oceans, the priest remembers. He, by contrast, tends this garden of sacred memory and pastors the new church built nearby in honor of the martyrs of the Soviet yoke. 2 days later, I sat in a cafe in the heart of Moscow, listening to Yuri Sipko, a retired Baptist pastor. In his village classroom in the 1950s in Siberia, Sipko and his classmates were given a badge with a portrait of Lenin. At age 11, the children were given the red scarf of the Young Pioneers, a kind of Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts for communist youth. Teachers drilled the children in the slogan of the pioneers, "Be ready, always be ready." I did not wear the
what?
Yeah, right. Build back better. I did not wear the pin with Lenin's face, nor did I wear the red scarf. I was a Baptist. I wasn't going to do that, recalls Sipko. I was the only one in my class. They went after my teachers. They wanted to know what they were doing wrong that they had a boy in her class who wasn't a pioneer. They pressured the director of the school, too. They were forced to pressure me to save themselves. Well, there's an answer to your question from earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Why do business owners do what they do? Pressure, peer pressure.
They got skin in the game.
Never undervalue the power of the mob, because your leaders do not. That's why they've weaponized the mob against you.
Or they want you to think that you are a minority.
Correct. Which we see happening in the churches now, all the time.
Because then you think that that the cause is fruitless, that you or that you are powerless.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
To be a Baptist in Soviet Russia was to know that you were a permanent outsider. They endured it because they knew that truth was embodied in Jesus Christ, and that to live apart from him would mean living a lie. For the Baptists, to compromise with lies for the sake of a peaceful life is to bend at the knee to death. When I think of,
Hold on, before you go on. There is a presumption here in this text, at least from the Baptist, right, that to wear the linen pen and to wear the red scarf is to contradict Christ, at least.
Yes.
That what is being demanded of them is a worshipful, obedience, subservience, idolatry, ultimately.
Correct.
And now I know we've had listeners that have pushed back on this.
Sure.
That don't see, the communist ideology as a religious ideology. I don't see it. They're demanding full obedience.
Correct.
And they don't subject themselves to
Correct.
any other, anything else. They are the chief authority in all matters of life and death.
Correct.
So that's only God can demand that kind of authority.
Who is it that's commanded to bend the knee? Is it the leaders? No. Is it their agents? No. It's the people. Who's commanded to wear the scarf? The leaders? No. They wear it in public as a sign of solidarity, but in private
Only when
they
they're
take
on
it
camera.
Only when they're on camera.
Right.
Period. Do they bend the knee? Only when they're on camera, if it's politically beneficial.
Well, yeah, and that's it. And then there are plenty of times where no, we don't need to. Only the the people bringing us our drinks and food.
Right. What
They have to wear
Russia
it, but we
had
don't.
that we have, but we refuse to acknowledge, is useful idiots. That's what propelled the Soviet system. That's what propelled the Soviet machine so far forward, even after it was completely bankrupt. It was the useful idiots, not the leadership.
Right. Well, the useful idiots at least saw that compliance had some, monetary gain or some kind of,
You got social currency. You got to live in peace. You weren't harassed. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's some earthly benefit to that. But the question is then, what else are you forfeiting?
Right.
And we saw this connects to COVID, right? It's like for us, to forfeit the public assembly of the church, out of fear of a virus, it wasn't worth it.
Well, to put it in frame it a different way, and I'll use myself as an example since it's easy to attack me. I have worn a mask 3 times in the last 2 years. All of them were in the hospital when I was sick. I refuse to wear a mask. I refuse to socially distance. I refuse to do anything that they tell me to do because it serves death. And
Because
I
you're
refuse.
contrarian. Yeah.
No, because it afflicts my conscience. And so I've been told that I have an extreme position. I've taken an extreme position that I won't comply. When I say it's tyrannical, it's malevolent, it's scientifically not true. It's not, you can't provide any data that shows that it's efficacious in any significant way whatsoever.
Towards the virus, certainly.
Yeah. And yet I'm called extreme. But I wonder, why is it that if my conscience is afflicted in this way and I'm drawing out this very strong assertion, theological assertion, that those of the faith immediately go to the far end of the spectrum to say, well, he's an extreme case. We don't want to be like him. We don't even want to talk to him about why he's saying these things or doing these things. We're just going to kick him out. We just don't want you to be a part of this anymore. Notice whenever someone's labeled an extreme, takes an extreme position as it's labeled, not necessarily because it is. Whenever we label someone as taking an extreme position, that allows us to immediately dismiss that person or that group
Right.
as being irrelevant to the conversation.
When in reality, 2 years ago, before COVID, it wasn't all that extreme a position, actually.
No.
Just to say, the evidence isn't in. And people would say, oh, okay.
Right.
Like, wait. But now this mass compliance thing, and it's interesting how quickly it came up. And I think, obviously there's terms of art, there's great skill in the propagandists. They've done a great job. They know what they're doing. They have plenty of role models and examples in history to use. And then obviously the technology we have today as far as mass communication, which you brought up before, has made it all the more easy.
Right. I just find it interesting in the church, and this goes back to the point of history. As a church historian by training, and as a historian through training as well, I just look back at history and say, well, what has happened when the church has complied with the state in similar matters? And the answer has always been the obliteration and annihilation of the church. Specifically, as we've read about before, the local priests and the local congregation.
Well, that's why I brought up Daniel in particular. It's like, he could have complied to get along and just kept his prayers private. Except what he recognized, and this comes up in the free speech section, is that the faith is proclaimed. It has to be, and it has to be practiced, and it's practiced publicly. It's part of our proclamation. We have windows on the church. You can see what we're doing. Yeah, and the doors are open. And that. Because it's for all nations, it's for all people, and it's even for Nebuchadnezzar, as an example, who then interestingly does have a confession of, at least
it's
Lord
a
of
confession.
Lords.
Yeah, it's a confession.
He's a God above all other gods. That's what he kind of says. That's probably after the burning fiery furnace, right? Yeah. So,
But go back to what Sipko says here in conclusion, that he would not compromise with lies for the sake of a peaceful life. For the sake of convenience and comfort, he would not compromise with their lies. Again, it's not about the mandates. It's the fact that they're lying about why we need mandates.
Correct.
And the fact that people comply with the mandates as if they're laws, when they're not. And everyone knows that. Why are they doing it? Why are they acting contrary to the truth? Because they don't want to compromise the comfortable, safe life that they're living. And so they bend a knee to death.
By the way, mandate, I found the legal definition of this. But I've been looking for it too, because I'm like, is it really a law? It's contractual law.
Yes.
And so legally, it has to do with contracts, and it requires an agreement on both sides, right?
Exactly.
So a mandate is only a law if we accept it as a law.
Correct.
If we don't accept the mandate, then it's not binding.
This is the subversive nature of lawyers, which is predominantly who make up our political leaders. They're all lawyers because you have to be to understand half the things that they write. It's not our fault if you abide by this mandate. If you follow the mandate, it's not our fault. We're not enforcing the mandate. You have to accept the mandate as if it was a law in order for it to become an actual contractual obligation.
Correct.
So in the end, just like with our tax money funding a certain lab that developed a certain thing that then the Chinese government admitted they purposely leaked in order to get people sick. And then you're like, oh, we paid for that? Yeah, we paid for that. Yeah, that was us. We didn't know we were, but that's what it was used for. Same thing is you're coming back and saying, no, you chose to abide by the mandate. We didn't force you to do that. That's the power of the mob. The state's saying, we didn't do anything. You did it.
You complied.
You complied.
We're not legally obligated for any kind of damages or anything like that because you went along with it.
It's like I was watching the video, the guy that, I can't remember what state it is, but the employer, he's got 4 restaurants and he fired all the employees that were vaccinated so that he had under 99 employees. Right. And then he took their wages and spread them out over the employees that were still there. He didn't have to do that though. He didn't have to fire those people who were vaccinated. He simply had to say, I refuse to abide by the mandate. But by firing the employees, he is contractually now obligated to abide by the mandates, because that's what he's doing in effect.
Yep. Yeah, he complied in his own way, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It doesn't matter how you comply, so long as you do.
All right. And the reason I brought that up in the Telegram post where you had all the questions is just to say the legal advice that I've heard, and then from people that are actually have actually brought charges. You know, there's a few hundred cases so far. There'll be thousands before too long. In all cases, as soon as you comply, Tyson Foods is the one in particular. Multiple cases against Tyson Foods in Tennessee. As soon as you comply, you have no legal standing.
Correct.
You actually have to show.
On.
You have to show the damage, and the damage can't be I was injured by the vaccine because they're not legally obligated on that. But you can show I lost my job.
Right.
They fired me. Not I quit, because as soon as you quit, now it's your action, you complied.
Correct.
It's like you have to know the law if you're going to be able to.
That's what they're counting on.
This. Yeah.
That's what they're counting on. It's like I've said before, when you go into a place and they refuse you service, and they know it's against the law to refuse you medical service, for example, and you threaten them with legal action, their attitude is, go ahead. We have a fleet of lawyers. Please, go ahead, sue us. We'll see you in 5 years. Oh, you needed a kidney before then? Well, then I guess your lawsuit's not going anywhere unless your family picks it up.
That's what the whistleblower, the most recent one from Pfizer on Project Veritas said.
The real one.
The real one, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Project Veritas, not Facebook. Project Veritas one. She said she counseled former DOJ. She counseled
I watched it.
whistleblower lawyers, and they all said, go to Project Veritas because otherwise nobody's going to hear this for years, and it's going to be too late.
Yeah, that was kind of a startling statement. You've got one shot. There's one door open to you, and it's them.
Nobody else is going to listen to you. Congress isn't going to listen to you. Mainstream press isn't going to listen to you.
No.
This is your shot. If you think this, if you care, basically you care about other people.
Right.
You're going to have to go take this course. It's the harder road by far because you're going to lose your job probably. You're going to be, under public scrutiny in a way that,
Well, you're on a lot of watch lists.
You're on watch lists.
So good luck getting another job in your area, your field,
in that
of,
field
of knowledge.
in that field. Yeah.
To be a Baptist in Soviet Russia was to know that you were a permanent outsider. They endured it because they knew that truth was embodied in Jesus Christ, and that to live apart from him would mean living a lie. For the Baptists, to compromise with lies for the sake of a peaceful life is to bend at the knee to death. When I think about the past, how our brothers were sent to prison and never returned, I'm sure that this is the kind of certainty they had, says the old pastor. They lost any kind of status. They were mocked and ridiculed in society. Sometimes they even lost their children. Just because they were Baptists, the state was willing to take away their kids and send them to orphanages. These believers were unable to find jobs. Their children were not able to enter universities, and still they believed. It's ironic because that's happening to my son right now. The Baptists stood alone, but stand they did. If you have been discipled in a faith that takes seriously the Apostle Paul's words, that to suffer for Christ is gain, and are prepared, as the Orthodox Kaleda family was, to live with reduced expectations of worldly success, it becomes easier to stand for the truth.
That is a key expression right there in the middle.
Yes, it is.
Reduced expressions of worldly success.
Expectations.
Yeah. What did you expect? What did I pick up on the other day? I was reading through James. James is he's pretty intense. I had forgotten how intense that book is. I thought it was all nice advice, but it's no.
It's interesting because in my ecosystem, in the fight community, we have a saying actually called manage your expectations.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Manage your expectations. Be sober and be realistic about what you expect from the fight, from your training, from this experience. Manage your expectations when you meet other people. So that when people meet you and they say, for example, this might be shocking to those of you who actually do know me. When people meet me for the first time, they say, you don't look like a pastor. To which I ask, what am I supposed to look like? I didn't realize there was an official, dress code. And I know exactly what they mean, but
there is a pant size, I think.
There is a pant size, exactly, and a hairline. But my question, I want them to admit to me what they're thinking. But now that's what I say to people. Well, then you should manage your expectations.
I think they expect pastors to look opulent, and like a kind of like a king. It's a weird kind of backwards thing because you don't pay.
That's exactly what they mean when they talk to me about that.
They don't pay you to be opulent, right? To
No.
have wealth.
What
and
they
status
mean
and all.
is you don't have a wheat belly, you're not wearing glasses, and you don't have a receding hairline,
Mm-hmm.
and you're not dressed funny. Yeah.
My eyes are shaped like footballs. I have to wear glasses.
Nice.
I was going to tell you about the James bet, James 4, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where do wars and fights come from among you? Do they not come from your desires for pleasure that
Yeah.
war in your members? You lust and do not have, you murder and covet and cannot obtain. This is expectation stuff. You fight and war, yet you do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you ask amiss that you may spend it on your pleasures.
Right.
Adulterers and adulteresses. Can you imagine preaching this? Well, actually, you do preach like this. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Whoever therefore wants to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God.
Right.
Right, and so that's the expectation. What were you expecting? You're living contrary to the lies of this world, a
Right.
world that's been subjected to Satan, right? And you expected it to go well.
Yeah. Well, this goes back to what I talk about in relation to the commands, which is
Mhm.
whatever is given to you in the way of gift is to be enjoyed. But what is not given to you in the way of gift is the temptation to believe that you're entitled to that thing. To James's point, when you live in the way of gift, you can manage your expectations because whatever God chooses to give to me is gift, and I accept it and I'm satisfied with it, no matter what it is, whether it be what the world defines as great or what the world defines as nothing.
The witch doctor or the universal health care.
Sure. Versus in the way of entitlement, the way of scarcity, the way of the law and the old Adam's thinking, which is even what I do have isn't enough, which goes back to money and power.
Correct.
It's not enough to have an 8-figure income. I could have a 9 or a 10-figure income if I just undercut Gillespie at the next job review. Or, you know what? I see what my neighbor has, and I just got to tell you, I don't think he deserves all that. Not like I deserve it. And then I work, in our catechism, this is covered under coveting. By a show of right, we get something that is not given to us in the way of gift. We entice and lure away from our neighbor, spouse, children, try and take their possessions through a show
But
of
it
right.
wasn't illegal.
Right, exactly. It's not a law, it's a mandate. So what happens then is when you manage your expectations in the way of Christ, you receive everything as gift, even your crosses. Versus outside of Christ, according to the way the world thinks, everything is about entitlement.
Yeah.
It's about taking. That's where wars come from. There's where conflict comes from.
You want what is not yours.
Yes, what God has not given to you in the way of gift.
Right.
So their children will not be able to enter universities. The Baptists stood alone, but stand they did. If you have been discipled in a faith that takes seriously the Apostle Paul's words that to suffer for Christ is gain, and are prepared as the Orthodox Kaleda family was to live with reduced expectations of worldly success, it becomes a lot easier to stand for the truth. Amen to that.
Yep. Just set your standards lower when it comes to the world. Right?
I don't think you have to set them lower. I think, again, you just have to accept that what you have is gift from God.
Well, maybe to rephrase this, I think just what do you consider worldly success, right?
Yeah.
Like for me, I mean, and for you too, for us, success would be, children that grow up to live in accord with God's word, whatever that looks like, right?
Yeah.
To marry or not married, to have children, whatever, if God grants them. But to live according to faith, according to the truth, rather than according to the lie. That's what success would look like, I guess. That's not worldly success. That doesn't mean they're going to be wealthy or they're going to be powerful or influential.
Well, it depends on how you define wealth. We've taught our children, for example.
Jesus, priceless treasure. Yeah, exactly.
My 18-year-old, he tells his younger siblings this all the time because it took root and grew and bore fruit for him, where he says, in life, you get one family, and if you're blessed, you get two. But that's it. And so he just tells his siblings, don't take for granted what mom and dad do for us or what we have here, because what we have is really special.
Where'd you get that wisdom? Wow.
You're welcome. Because I didn't have it, and neither did my wife. And so for us, that clan identity, and to say, listen, your family is a gift. You may not like your family every day. You may not agree with what your parents or your siblings do all the time, but that's just sin. That's just garden variety sin. It's just selfishness.
Yep.
However, The fact that you have parents, for example, who cherish you and love you unconditionally and care enough about you to put boundaries around you to protect you from yourself and others. The fact that you have siblings who genuinely care about your well-being and don't take every opportunity to beat you up, put you down, take advantage of you, or treat you like you're a stranger, that's a gift. The fact that you have a home that you don't feel that you always have to be in survival mode when you're in your house because you're safe there, that's a gift. Yeah. The fact that your parents are Christians and they raised you in the faith in such a way that baptism, the Lord's Supper, and the gospel take precedent over moral teachings, for example, that's a gift. And you get that one time, 2 at the most. But think about that. Yeah. You get that one time. That's a gift. And if you take advantage of it and think, I could get this anywhere, you're a fool. You don't know that you grew up eating steak. So then someone offers you a hot dog and you say to yourself, oh my God, hot dogs. Why have I been abused my whole life and not allowed to eat these hot dogs? Because your parents love you. And they give you steak.
To give, rather than, meat of unknown origin.
Correct. Again, go back to Great Outdoors with John Candy and Dan Aykroyd. You know what's in those hot dogs, don't you, Chet? And then I can't say the rest of it because this is a family show. But
yeah, exactly.
Go watch the clip. The Great Outdoors, classic movie. Classic.
All right, I'll find it. We'll put it in the show notes.
There we go. So let's continue then into the next section. Reject doublethink and fight for free speech. As we talked about before we hit record, it was there all the time, like we've talked about with so many other things, but the suppression of the proclamation of the truth in the churches has really ramped up, especially this year, actually, more than last year. This year, I've watched the churches attack the proclamation of the truth for the sake of self-preservation. I'll just argue it subjectively. Yeah. They say it's for the sake of love for the neighbor. I see it as spiritual cowardice. Preach the platitudes, keep people satisfied and happy, keep them coming back, keep the ship steered in the same direction, everything's fine. Definitely don't quote Solzhenitsyn. Don't preach from this book. You're just going to upset people. Again, you got to keep that squishy middle happy because they're the ones who paid the bills.
Well, and there is some truth to that.
There is, absolutely. 100%. Yeah. I'm not denying it.
Yeah.
But it's about managing expectations. And are you free in Christ to preach so boldly the truth about Jesus Christ that you can be fired and not worry about where your paycheck's going to come from or how you're going to feed your family? Or is that your priority? Is that your first priority? I got to make sure that the checks are coming in. I got to make sure my family's fed. Got to make sure everybody's on the same plane here.
Yeah. I mean, you can start there or you can end there.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's just not a very fulfilling life, I suppose. Short term.
Yeah.
It's comfortable, but it doesn't last. And, and you're constantly going to be chasing that. Mm-hmm. And of course you end up living in fear too of that, all that being taken away from you, which is completely reasonable according to God's word. He may take it all away from you because you trust in it.
With or without your compliance, by the way.
Correct.
Okay, here we go. Gotta clear my throat so I can pronounce these names. Vladimir, Grigorenko, and Olga Rusanova, husband and wife, immigrated from Ukraine to the United States in the year 2000 and now live in Texas. Shocking. They tell me that if you grow up in a culture of lies, as they did, you don't know that life could be any other way. Mm-hmm. And then they moved to Texas.
The Free State.
Right. Oh, that's funny.
Of all the states to pick, I mean.
Right. That's awesome.
It makes sense.
The general culture taught you doublethink, says Grigorenko. That was normal life. In high school and middle school, we had to write essays like normal school kids do, says Rusanova, but you never could write what you think about the subject. Never, ever. The subject could be interesting, but you never can say what you really think. You have to find some way to relate it to the communist point of view. Otherwise, you might be labeled a domestic terrorist.
Right, but I was thinking of the church too, and the way that we have to
absolutely
make everything Christian. And you're actually, the way that I maintain my car, I don't know how you can fit Christ into that, being a Christian mechanic or something. I know. Maybe in the way that you serve your neighbor
you
through it.
You could screw a crucifix into the manifold. So every time they open the hood of the car, there's Jesus.
Oh, that's a perfect hood ornament, right?
Right. Because nothing says I'm a Christian like a Jesus hood ornament.
Or a bobblehead.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My buddy, no pun intended, my buddy gave me the Buddy Jesus statue from Dogma. And it's a dash, so it sticks to the dash. And he's got that, he's pointing and winking. So I would say to my wife, I love having that Jesus on my dash because whenever I ask Buddy Jesus whether I should do something or not, he always says yes.
Always affirmative. Yeah.
Always affirming me. It's fantastic.
Well, but the reason I brought that up is that, it's the same thing with a religious ideology like communism.
Yes, it is.
It's like you can shoehorn it into anything.
Correct.
But you end up distorting the thing. Like was in the last section with the earth sciences. I mean, we're seeing this woke ideology, which is just it's a hybridization of communism and socialistic nationalism and applied to all ethics and all morality, right? And you can shoehorn that into any discipline,
right?
Not just like popular culture, media, that kind of thing, but
But this goes back to the people's
you're meeting
revolution,
like quotas in the earth sciences,
right?
Like what?
But remember, like in Mao's Cultural Revolution, the Youth Revolution, everything has to be politicized so that the Communist Party can involve itself in every aspect of your life.
So there can't be
anything left out of communism. Otherwise, the state doesn't have an excuse for interjecting itself into it.
And
Same
I wanted
thing
to bring
with what you said, dogmatic Christianity, institutional Christianity has to inject itself into every corner of your life so that it can control every corner of your life.
I'll go listen to the Christendom episodes from way back at the beginning of the show.
Right.
I
should just go back and read that.
We probably should because we read it differently, I think, today.
Oh, heck yeah.
I was going to suggest something on the show I was thinking about because somebody asked me, like, why is it that the battle is being waged on so many different fronts? Because you've got it economically, politically, scientifically, you have it
educationally,
medically. You have sovereignty, you have borders being attacked.
In sports. Yeah.
You have it in sports. Why is it in every aspect of life? And it's exactly this point.
Right.
It does split your defense, right? Because you can't defend yourself against all of these things at once.
Well, it's like I said to you the other day, it exhausts you to the point where you just give up.
Right. But it is the second point here is that it has to be ideologically applied everywhere and in everything.
Right.
Right? Because
then you don't have to think.
Correct.
It doesn't require any critical thought because you just simply, it's like I was saying, so we play this game on the way home from the gym at night where I play songs from different generations and the kids have to guess the artist in the song. So we start off like with the 70s and then we move into the 90s usually because that's their favorite kind of genre is grunge.
Thank you, Dad.
And what's that?
I said, thank you, Dad.
You're welcome. It's analog, man. And my 14-year-old, she knows the lyrics to all the songs, but she doesn't pay attention to the band, the artist, or the name of the song, right? So my daughter's kind of like the 5-year-old in Sunday school, where I'm like, okay, Alma, who is this? Nirvana? I'm like, no, honey, it's not Nirvana.
Jesus?
Exactly. It's like and then when it gets to a Nirvana song, I'm like, okay, go. She's like, Nirvana? I'm like, yes. What's the name of the song? I only know the chorus. I'm like, I love you, but stop doing that. You're hurting your father. And it's the same way with communism. It doesn't matter what you're doing. You just apply the party verbiage, the jargon of the party to that thing.
Well,
and that
Mao
proves
said,
that you're part of the cult.
Blah, 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 blah. Yeah.
Exactly.
Or Lenin said.
Right. Yeah. That's why I said, this woman from ESPN that's about to be fired for making a benign comment about her multiracial background and then, using as an example, Barack Obama's multiracial background. That had nothing to do with sports. She was doing it on a podcast and she was acting as an independent person. She didn't represent the company. She wasn't on ESPN's ground. She was in her apartment. And yet they're probably going to fire her for her statements. Why? Because she didn't say what she's supposed to say.
She's operating outside the ideological framework that they've set up. Yeah.
Exactly. And you're like, but what does my biracial heritage have to do with the corporation and its brand? And the answer is nothing. And by the way, you're firing a black woman for making a comment about another black person because what they said is indicative of white privilege. And it's like, well, my mom was white and his mom was white, but both of our fathers are black, so we're biracial. But
so we can't, it obviously it's logically inconsistent.
Correct.
And we can't make sense of it.
Right.
But that's the whole point.
Which is why, like, for example, when we're recording this Dave Chappelle's final special for Netflix, The Closer, they're accusing him of white privilege because to the point, we've covered this before, your skin color has nothing to do with the ideology.
We talked about Larry Elder was that way
Yes.
too.
And so the problem is
How
you
dare
and
he
I
be a
think like
libertarian,
rational
right?
human beings. And we're like, no, he's objectively black. And I am objectively super, super white.
Mm-hmm.
But the ideology, no matter how contrarian it may be to objective reality, says, no. He's white. Even though his skin color is not white. Because you're not a part of the sect. You're not a part of the cult. And therefore, the cult will determine for you your skin color, your race, your gender, everything. And it doesn't matter if you look at that person and go, but that's in defiance of reality. It doesn't matter because this has nothing to do with reality. It has to do with the party.
I mean, I suppose there's some truth in that.
Lipson, etc. Exactly.
I suppose you did watch the clip. I suppose that, sometimes the slave becomes the master, right? They take on the persona of oppressed becomes the oppressor.
What's the nature of the institution, right?
They learn from the experts. So recognizing that, I suppose it's true, but it's not fairly applied. I think that's what we're talking about here.
Right.
It's like, no, Dave Chappelle is, he's extremely wealthy. He can only say the same things he said because he's gotten burned before, right?
Right.
By
But
Comedy
as one
Central.
person noted, when he sat in that rotunda that he built on his property and he had the people come out and
That was the last special, right?
where he railed, well, it wasn't really the special. It was just 20, 25 minutes of him basically monologuing about how angry he was
That wasn't a special. Okay.
about the shooting at that time and race relations. There was nothing funny about that. It wasn't even intended to be comedy.
Was that the one that was like 6 minutes or whatever? He did it was the time that the knee was on the neck. That was the name of it.
Yeah.
Can't
That
remember
wasn't
how
intended to be funny. It was just him ranting because he wanted to get it out. And the same group that is attacking him now praised him for that. Because he said what he was supposed to say according to the party. And now he's not saying what he's supposed to say according to the party, and therefore now he is out. And therefore, going back to the essay, that's the nature of any cult.
Yeah, can't he just be Dave Chappelle? And sometimes you agree with him, and sometimes you don't. Sometimes he's funny,
Because
sometimes he's not.
Dave Chappelle is whatever the party says he is. You and I exist at the privilege extended to us by the party, by the cult.
Well, this is what I brought up with his contract with Netflix. It's explicit that they don't have actually rights over what he says because he's been burned by that before.
Right.
He wanted to have that
Well, and
creative
to their
freedom.
credit, they gave him back legal control over the Chappelle Show. And they
Yeah, that's
paid
right.
him for that, which is astounding for a multinational corporation to say, because he covered this in his last special, where he's like, don't watch the show, boycott it. I'm talking to you, Netflix. And then the guy from Netflix is like, what are you owed? And they just gave it to him. And they're like, you want your property back?
That's after
cool.
he had lost the lawsuit. Yeah.
Yeah. They had no legal precedent for doing what they did for him, and they did it anyways. But that's the nature of the institution, because the same institution that did that for Dave is the same institution that promotes a lot of shows that are explicitly manipulative and target and groom children.
The Cuties one. And
Yeah, the Cuties one and everything else that comes after that. My Little Ponies, that's gross. They're pushing a political agenda. So you look at it and go, well, which is the face of the institution? The answer is yes, because the institution is more than any individual or even any group of people.
Well, they know everything's a moving target, and they're just doing their
Correct.
best to hit the target more often than not.
Right. Well, Lenin made the rules because Trotsky drew them up for him. And then after Trotsky drew up the rules, Lenin's like, well, we got to get rid of this guy. Because Trotsky was like, you're not doing it the way we planned. And Lenin's like, listen, man, there's a difference.
That's not
between...
the point. That's not the
Right.
point.
You know, Trotsky's like, man, remember the dream? And Lenin's like, look at reality, dude. We're in control now. And he's like, but we can't lose track of this is the revolution. And Lenin's like, yeah, I mean, it's still the revolution. I'm just saying that this feather bed is kind of comfortable, man. And I got a
was gonna say
chauffeur. And
the cult leaders don't drink their own Kool-Aid usually.
correct. But then you see, okay, Lenin's going to tweak the rules. And by the way, Trotsky was assassinated by the Russians. Lenin draws up the rules. Here's the rules for the communist revolution. And then Stalin gets a hold of it and goes, no, I'm going to write this basically dogmatics about the rules and just push it to the next level. So when Khrushchev comes along, he's just on cruise control. And then you have Brezhnev. And then, of course, Brezhnev gives way eventually to Gorbachev and then Yeltsin.
I say ball guy with the spot. Yeah.
Yeah, but by the time you get to Gorbachev and Yeltsin in relationship to a guy like Stalin or Khrushchev or even Brezhnev in the 70s, like Brezhnev, like his face is burned into my mind because he looked like a Russian bear. He looked like a Muppet.
But by that time, the
Yeah.
the mobs and their
Yes.
control over Russia are so incredible. Not just the Soviet mob, but then all the other private black market mobs.
Right.
It's,
Right.
yeah.
Because
It's
you have
through
to
all
kill
of Eastern Europe.
You have to kill off the first generation because they know what life was like before the revolution. And then their children live in fear. So they participate in the lie. And then their children grow up going, why are we doing this? Like, because kids can see that. Like
The
inherently
emperor has
kids-
no clothes. Yeah.
Right. But they're taught by their parents, don't say anything, just go along with this. And then the grandchildren are the ones who start talking. Low voices in corners where no one can hear really. The grandchildren
Right.
talk.
But that's
And
the
then in
failure
fourth-
of tribal mentality, right? Where
Yeah.
the tribe actually breaks apart, and because
Correct.
they don't remember the fear and terror that of the grandparents, which is
Right.
probably a good thing then.
Well, it's the same thing in Northern Ireland for generations with the conflict in Northern Ireland. And eventually in the 90s, the great grandchildren, 5 generations were like, we're done. We're done. We're over this. And both sides said we're over it. And
Well,
then
it became a lie, actually.
it became a lie. And if you're in Ireland, I would love to hear your opinion on this, actually, because I've only heard it from people in Ireland who have told it to me. So I'm reporting this secondhand. But essentially, that's kind of what paved the way for what's happening in Ireland today. We don't want conflict in our nation anymore. We don't want these things happening
We
in our
grew up
streets.
with that. Yeah, we grew up with that.
We want peace, and we want to just live with each other and get along with each other and enjoy life.
And we're willing to sacrifice even our identity. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the latest government comes along and goes, hey, we're going to lock you down and use the island as a petri dish for this vaccine. How do you like that?
Yeah, yeah. And we're going to build, communist style housing and
Yeah.
surveillance state and the whole deal.
Same thing with Australia. Yeah.
Yeah.
So here we go. High school, middle school. When a people grow accustomed to living in lies, well, here we go. When people grow accustomed to living in lies, shunning taboo writers and conforming to the official story, it deforms their way of thinking, says Grigorenko. And that is very difficult to overcome. He is concerned by polls showing that Americans' support for the First Amendment, which guarantees the constitutional right to free expression, is waning, especially among younger Americans, who are increasingly intolerant of dissenting opinion. Grigorenko sees this as a sign that society prefers the false peace of conformity to the tensions of liberty. To grow indifferent, even hostile to free speech, is suicidal for a free people.
I should read you the quote from my Facebook wall when I posted the thing about the First Amendment. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it's a family member, so I don't want to share it. But it effectively said, well, there's a lot of times where you have to give up that right. I'm like, no, never. No, because as soon as you give it up, it no longer is a right.
Right.
When you say, well, there's times, whether it's a virus or it's this or that.
Yelling fire in a theater.
Yeah. Well, that was the argument that was made.
Yeah.
You're like, no, that you're still free to do that. There may be consequences that are very negative for you and for your neighbors.
Right. That's why I teach my kids. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's a freedom that needs to be exercised
Right.
Judiciously, right?
Right.
With restraint, knowing here's a time to speak and there's a time to be silent.
Right.
Of course. Right. But to take away that right to speak
Right.
means that you no longer you can't redress your grievances.
Right.
You can't publicly proclaim the gospel because maybe they'll say that's a offensive speech.
Yeah.
Whatever it is, whatever you want to forfeit there. And the tension, of course, that people are uncomfortable with is that means that you have other people saying things that you don't want to hear,
Yeah.
or that you don't believe, or that you don't agree with, or you think are harmful. Yeah, okay. What's the antidote? Speak the truth.
Right.
But we don't. I think that this is the struggle that I've seen. We've seen it in the churches that people don't actually think the truth will win over lies.
Right.
They don't think it's
Because
never
what
mind.
they're arguing isn't the truth.
Well, maybe that's part of the problem, right? We call things truth that aren't necessarily truth.
When you speak the truth, you don't need to censor or delete or make people silence their voices, because the truth stands on its own objectively as being true.
Well, we have that confidence.
Yeah.
Well, namely because of Jesus being the truth.
Correct.
Right? With that truth. but like scientific consensus isn't truth.
No.
Peer review is not truth.
No.
It may be reality as we know it. Use that language.
Right.
Or it's our perception of how things are.
Right.
But it is just perception then.
Right.
Right. And so what is true? So like, for example, we could do the gender topic, which is fun. You know, how do we know that's true? Well, ultimately for us, it's because God said, I made you male and female.
Correct. Yeah.
Now it's also revealed to us, you know, anatomically, biologically,
Right.
in most cases, right? There's obviously exceptions where things get a little wonky, but
Right.
most cases, you know, people have the parts, they have the chromosomes.
Right.
That's revelation of a sort, but is it true? Only because God says it's true, right? In a very particular way,
Yeah.
grammatically
and then
and
creation
biologically.
backs it up.
Right, exactly. Right. Those two coupled together, the book of, what did they call it? The book of nature and the book of the word?
Yeah.
Yeah,
That's right.
But
Book of faith and book of nature.
But nature is subject to God's word.
Correct.
Our understanding of nature, like for example, the topic of, you know, we're stewards of creation. That's how we talk about it, right? Well, one, we refer to it as a creation, which we only know that from
Which
God's
implies
word.
a creator. Yeah.
Right. But the idea that we are to have dominion and to care for all creatures and all animals and to name them and to steward them. You know, I like Teddy Roosevelt on that, right? You know, I think,
Right.
you know, be a conservationist. That's good.
Did you read that the EPA spent $90 million over the last 10 years on furniture for their offices?
Wooden furniture?
No, like office furniture, like desks and chairs and lamps and stuff. $90 million in 10 years for office furniture.
EPA,
Yeah.
Environmental Protection Agency.
Yeah.
Right, but again, the point is that our understanding of how to act within this world and what's true and good, right, and beautiful, ultimately for us is derived from God's word.
100%.
And without that,
Yeah.
you know, what are people relying upon? I think there was an institutional.
The science.
Well, no, there was an institutional like morality or ethic that lingered and that was, you know, being passed down from generation to
It was
generation.
the Judeo-Christian ethic,
Yeah,
for
whatever
lack
that
of
means.
it was, or natural law, however you want to refer to it. But there
Right, it
was
was ultimately dependent upon God's word again.
right.
But it got divorced from that, and then
Correct.
it was malleable and
Right.
could be conformed to whatever image we want it to
But
fall under.
to push that too, within the churches, especially every church adapted itself to a prevailing Western philosophy, whether it be Platonism or Aristotelianism primarily.
That's true.
And therefore, even within Christianity, there was pagan philosophy. So there was the assumption that this philosophy of Plato, this philosophy in the tradition of Aristotle, objectively speaking, were mirrors of God's law.
Well, it's
and
because they were
therefore
so smart.
useful.
They were
Yeah.
so smart.
But there was still the basis, even if you debated that, like with the Via Negativa and the Via Moderna, where we're going to choose two different philosophers' worldviews to argue from. But they still accepted the fact that they were legitimate worldviews from which to argue. Whereas today, we don't. We have no objective worldview from which to argue collectively as a group, and therefore we're all scattered little atomized individuals trying to figure out our morality for ourself, like we talked about, by ourself. And then we try and surround ourselves. We work our whole life to surround ourselves with people that will ape or agree that our moral worldview, our moral foundation is right.
And
And
I
then
think
the better you are at expressing and communicating that, the better you are at arguing, persuading, the bigger the group.
Well, and this is the struggle of, you know, Christians here, because we, you know, in the congregation, they look at it and say, how could this be happening? Because
Right.
they still have that moral ethical framework from the Torah, right, from the law
Right.
of God.
Yeah.
And they're still operating under that presumption. It is guiding them to some degree in their life,
Yeah.
right?
Some degree.
Consciously or unconsciously, probably unconsciously more than anything. And then they look at the world and they're like, well, no, that's because they've completely forfeited
Right.
that basis for ethic moral framework. And so, of course, they don't treat you as human. Why? Because they don't value life. Why?
Correct.
Because they don't actually believe that life is given. They think
Right.
that life is something that you
accident. Yeah.
take. Or an accident, yeah. Yeah, that it's immaterial and that
Right.
it has no intrinsic value.
Yeah.
Okay.
In that sense, you know, he was right when he wrote Leviathan.
Well, that's what I've
That's-
been arguing. Yeah.
yeah.
I mean, he wasn't a Christian, but
That's what I'm saying, though, is the way that we conceive of the body and then the body politic and society. It's very mechanical.
Well, Hobbes was willing to, I think, based on my reading of it, he was willing to say what you call Judeo-Christian worldview, that was a good moral ethical framework for our country.
Right.
And that if we broke away from that, we would see, the machine basically.
Well, that
take
was
over.
Nietzsche's argument too, is that the Jewish worldview in the Old Testament was the right worldview. And then the Christians came along and turned that upside down and turned it into a victim culture, a culture of pity for the weakest and the lowest.
Right.
And that if we went back to the Torah in particular, like Nietzsche was particularly impressed by the Torah and saying, that's a true human being, that's what we're all supposed to be, and that's a true God, that's what every God should be.
Well, but this is actually true. I mean, he's right in that that the law belongs to the state.
Yeah.
Not the gospel.
Right.
We don't want our state to be merciful and gracious and kind and gentle. But they act like they do, and it's like no, you want them to enforce the law,
hope and change,
right?
Yeah,
but the whole thing with like pardons and that they just use that for political or economic gain again. It's not actually about being just.
Which, for those of you who are not informed, a significant majority of people crossing the border are prisoners from other countries.
That were set free.
Those of us who lived through the Cuban boat crisis, was that the 70s or early 80s? Yeah. When Castro just emptied all the prisons and sent them to Florida. That's what they're doing now. So those Haitians that we've covered before, that's why they're coming.
Those 13 that died in Afghanistan, the suicide bomber had been released the day before.
Correct.
From prison. So that was the deal. We'll let you out.
Right. So all of those, and I'm not saying all, I'm just saying we have human trafficking going on in significant numbers at the border. The drug cartels are controlling that. A lot of those so-called refugees are actually, again, convicts who were kicked out of prisons in their own country, so the country didn't have to take care of them.
By the way, they're not all Hispanic either.
And they're not all Hispanic either.
A large portion of them are coming not just from Haiti, but coming from Africa, coming from Middle East, coming from I mean, there's Afghan refugees coming in through the southern border. Like, how did
ask yourself, how are they getting there?
That? How do they do that? How do they get through the Darien Gap? How do you get through that?
Right.
How do you get across the Mexican border?
Yeah.
I don't know.
I was listening to Tim Kennedy yesterday talk about the difficulties they had in getting people onto planes and getting them out of the airport in Kabul.
So how did the refugees pull it off?
And yet these refugees just seem to walk on water. They just teleport.
They got from like Niger.
Yeah.
Like
here. And then how did they get from the border to Wisconsin, for example? How did that happen when they have no money and no resources, no contacts in this country?
Buses and planes and free cell phones.
Hey, thank you, Roman Catholic Charities. But the point is that this is how the party functions. This is how the state functions. It lives by lies. And essentially everything they say is a lie because they couch it in hope. They couch it in the promise of life. They couch it in the promise of mercy and kindness.
False gospel.
False gospel. Exactly. And if you dig
a
too deep into it, you're
Jesus
triangulated
Christ,
and you're excommunicated. You're a heretic.
Well, and it's the same argument we've made about peace, or at least I have. All we were saying is give peace a chance. A peace apart from forgiveness of sins in Christ Jesus is never going to be peace.
No.
It's just, it's an agreement not to be at war for a moment.
Yeah. John Lennon was really down with Mao and the Communist Party from his estate.
What, he gave him a lot of money?
No, not really. He just continued to be a rich, world famous millionaire, rock star, who would like to incorporate quotes from the Red Book into his songs.
Right. Okay. I see what you're saying.
Yeah. He was super down with the revolution.
He didn't live by the lie. He actually just promoted it.
Correct.
Because it was expedient to his
just like the celebrities today. Exactly.
Oh,
exactly.
Okay.
False peace of conformity to the tensions of liberty. To grow indifferent, even hostile to free speech is suicidal for a free people. In this country, what we need to do is to protect free speech, says Grigorenko, who became a proud American citizen in 2019. The First Amendment is important.
Only country with one.
Yep. For us, the Soviet Constitution had no meaning. Everybody knew these were just words that had no relation to real life, which is exactly where I'm at today. In this country, the Constitution is meaningful, just to the poor who believe it's actually valid.
You still have rights on paper.
On paper. We have an independent judiciary. We don't. We have to protect it. We do. We don't need to invent anything new. Correct. We just need to have the courage to protect what we have. Yes.
Or reform. Yeah.
Yeah.
Protect and
Defending
reform.
the right to speak and write freely, even when it costs you something, is the duty of every free person. So says Maria Whitner, a hero of the 1956 Hungarian uprising against Soviet occupation. A communist court sentenced Whitner, then only 20, to death, though this was later commuted to life in prison. Once I said to one of the guards in prison, "You're lying." For that alone, I was taken to trial again, remembers the feisty Whitner. The state prosecutor said to me, "Whitner, why did you accuse the guard of being a liar? Why didn't you just say you're not telling the truth?" I said, "It matters that we speak plainly." Mic drop, walk off the stage.
I like this woman.
For her insolence, Whitner was sent back to prison with extra punishments. She had to sleep on a wooden bed with no mattress and was given reduced rations. By the time her sentence was commuted and she was released, Whitner weighed scarcely 100 pounds. Nevertheless, she insists that a broken body is a price worth paying for a strong and undefiled spirit. Whoo!
There's a bunch of interviews on YouTube you can watch with her.
Is there? Well, no,
Yeah.
I got to do that. That's my afternoon now. Sorry to all my students tonight if I don't show up with lessons.
I mean, they're not all in English, but you have to deal with that.
That's fine, subtitles. We live in a world of lies, whether we want it or not. That's just the case. But we should not accommodate it, she tells me as I sit at her table in suburban Budapest. You will be surrounded by lies. You don't have a choice. Don't assimilate to it. It's an individual decision for each person. If you want to live in fear, or if you want to live in the freedom of the soul. If your soul is free, then your thoughts are free. And then your words are going to be free. Under hard totalitarianism, dissenters like Whitner paid a hard price for their freedom, but the terms of the bargain were clear. Under soft totalitarianism, it is more difficult to see the costs of compromising your conscience. But as Maria Whitner insists, you can't escape the decisions. You have to live in a world of lies, but it's your choice as to whether that world lives in you.
That's a good quote.
Yeah, it is.
So, yeah, and that's why I brought up the quote from James. I mean, this is nothing new. I mean,
No.
James is talking about that. He's obviously living in Roman occupation, right?
Yeah.
And so, he understands this. It's like, no, we're not going to subject ourselves, to this world. We're not going to live according to what they say. And anytime, like that whole moral ethical framework that he presents of like, when you try to live the way that the world would have you live, you get none of what you're looking for.
Yeah.
You're never going to be content. You're actually going to be, you live by a lie, you're going to be a liar.
Right.
And you're going to be subject to everything that comes with that.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I said that in the sermon last Sunday that the church cannot allow politics, political or pharmaceutical powers to get a foothold in the churches in any way, shape, or form in the smallest of ways. Because we don't serve the state and we don't serve the pharmaceutical industry. They don't get to make choices for the church.
Remember when I shared that with you from my governor here, when he was talking about getting the pastors in the churches on board with the vaccination mandates,
Right.
and all of it, because they are, what did he call us? Like influencers, but something, it was stronger than that. We're like community organizers or something like that. Right. And it was grossly offensive to me. It's like, I'm not going to mandate to my people, something that, invades their person.
Right.
Never mind us and the lack of legal, whatever the legal thing is. I can't remember the word. Repercussions. That's a good word.
Yeah.
Right. There's no legal repercussions. There's nothing you can do. There's no remedy you can do. I'm not going to demand that. I believe that the person, that they've been given that freedom by God. That's their,
Right.
it's their body to be used for God's good purpose.
Yeah. So let's bring that back around to the churches to wrap it up.
Yeah.
Because I've had this conversation actually a number of times just in the past month of people texting me or emailing me or calling me to say, my pastor is not preaching the gospel of Jesus Christ. And the gifts aren't there every Sunday. And as far as pastoral care goes, I can't really talk to him about what is afflicting my conscience in regards to the mandates, for example, at work. Or he refuses to talk to me about a religious exemption, or when I bring it up, he tells me that's not loving my neighbor, it's not being faithful to Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And the overwhelming kind of sense of and thesis is, so I just do my best, and I just remember he's my pastor, and I got to pray for him. And I'm like, no. If he's not preaching the gospel, and he's not making the gifts of salvation a priority, and he's not ministering to you, he's not shepherding you when your conscience is afflicted, he's not being your pastor.
No.
And sitting around and waiting for him to change isn't going to change anything. Speak the truth, and if he doesn't listen, kick the dirt off your feet and go find a pastor who will preach the gospel to you, give you the gifts, and minister to you.
It's like his conscience is going to be informed just naturally without you actually saying anything to it.
Right.
Right. He needs that conscience.
You risk being ostracized by your church.
Correct.
You risk being vilified by not just the pastor, but perhaps by your family and friends within the church. But ask yourself, like I said earlier, when you're labeled an extremist for demanding that the gospel of Jesus Christ be preached consistently, that the gifts be there regularly, even if it's not every week, at least every other week, or your pastor is saying to you, if you need the sacrament weekly, I will bring it to you, or you can come to church and I'll give it to you weekly if you need it. And you come to me and say, I need it, I'll give it to you. If your pastor is not doing that, he is not ministering to you. He's not pastoring to you. And if your congregation, your family, friends, or otherwise, label you as an extremist or a troublemaker, or make you think you're the only person in that church who's asking these questions or making a fuss about it,
right?
Kick the dirt off your feet. You're not losing anything. You're losing oppression. You're losing your voice being silenced for demanding the gospel be preached.
Yeah.
But Jesus' directive to us is very, very clear.
But that's the language of this book. You're living a lie. You keep telling yourself this is God's church, this is Christian preaching, and it's not.
No.
Now, I mean, you could do something about that. If you believe the person does want to be a faithful preacher of God's word, then you call him to repentance. You show him, and you can do it. You can do it with the questions, right? I mean, maybe I think most pastors aren't going to respond well to the full, frontal attack.
No.
Right. But you say, I listened to your sermon on Sunday, and I was trying to figure out, like, where's Jesus? How does he fit into this?
Right.
Did Jesus, you don't want to be too offensive. I was going to say, did Jesus have to die for your sermon to be true?
Right.
I love that diagnostic.
Mm-hmm.
I try to apply it to my own sermon, but, they may not respond as well to that. But it's like, well, where's this written? I think is a good question too, right?
Right.
I need more scripture here. I need to understand what basis, you're coming to from this. And, so I better understand, we can better understand each other. And maybe he sees, like, I don't really know why I said what I said. I don't know why I believe what I believe. Romans 13, do whatever the state tells you to do. I'm like, is that really what it says?
No.
Can't go back.
You forgot the comma.
Yeah.
There's still that thing about God.
Well, I pointed this out on Facebook today. I love just kind of like triggering people. So that's what I use it for. Isn't that what you're supposed to use it for? I think so.
Sure.
Just say, well, look, if Romans 13 teaches that the state was established by God, then it has to be governed by God's word.
Correct.
And if it's not being governed by God's word, it's no longer operating according to God's establishment.
Exactly.
I was like, what?
It's pretty simple.
Oh, you mean he wouldn't establish a state that operates according to its own law? No.
Again, go read the history of Israel. He establishes many governments and tears many governments down for rebelling against his word. Go read the reforms of Hezekiah.
Right. So that's how you understand we must obey God rather than men, is to say, well, if they're not operating according to God's mandate, then...
Right. And here's some guidelines for the proclamation of the gospel as I was taught them. These are... Yes. We used to call them rules for proclaimers, but that was too legalistic, so we took away the term rules and went, they're suggestions. Otherwise known as, you must preach this way to preach the gospel. Yeah, okay. 1, the gospel is always present tense. 2, the gospel is always unconditional. 3, Jesus is the subject of all of the verbs of salvation, and you are the direct object that receives the action of the verb. And 4th, it must be for you for the forgiveness of sin. Unconditional, present tense, you're the object that receives the action of Jesus for you for the forgiveness of sin.
I know that all seems inherently obvious, doesn't it?
Not in my experience.
No.
The number of churches I've walked out of in the middle of sermons and conferences and retreats.
Yeah.
The
It could
answer
be
is
any number
no.
of those things, right? Or more, one or more. It could be not for me,
Right.
not now, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not forgiveness of sins.
It's usually, it takes place in the past, and it's about Jesus, and then applied to us in the present tense through, well, now go and do likewise.
Obligation, obedience. Yeah.
And it
duty.
switches from Jesus being the subject of the verbs in the past to me being the subject of the verbs in the present.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then it becomes, that's not the gospel. It's not even law. It's gospel. It's creamer sermons.
Creamer.
Half and half.
Yeah.
Right? It's being gummed to death by a million goldfish. But the law has no bite. It has no traction because it's not being preached lawfully. And the gospel is not evangelical because it's not for you for the forgiveness of sins.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I teach my confirmands this to the point where they're militaristic about it. If they don't hear the for you soon enough in the sermon, they'll start looking at me. And they give me that look that I taught them to give me. And their parents are like, why, my kid gets really antsy in the middle of your sermons and starts saying, Mom, where's the for you? And I'm like, what? I'm like, it's because I taught them. This is what's necessary. You need the comfort that the gospel bequeaths to you. And the comfort comes from the for you for the forgiveness. This is the New Testament in my blood shed for you for the forgiveness of sins.
Yeah. What is necessary to believe? The words for you.
Yeah.
Require our
Oh,
hearts.
I taught that I always teach that at the intro, the first day of confirmation. That's the first thing I teach from the preface. But then I go to that. Who is worthy and well prepared to receive the Lord's Supper? Whoever believes these words, given and shed for you for the forgiveness of sins, because these words for you require all hearts to believe. And again, their parents are convicted because their parents don't believe it.
Not
It's all
for you.
about what you memorize. It's all about what you understand. And I just tear them apart.
Not for you now.
Not for you
Maybe for
now,
you
but it will
later.
be in 8 months or 8 years. And I just tell the parents, okay, since I don't understand and I've devoted the last 30 years of my life to studying this, why don't you tell me? Tell me how God is present on all the altars simultaneously and yet at the right hand of the Father and yet fills the universe with his presence.
Right. And gives to you to eat and drink of his flesh and blood without it being consumed.
Without it being consumed, and yet you are consuming it. I'm like, you know what you do with that? You confess it and you either trust that it's true or not. That's what the word faith means. He is worthy and well prepared who believes. And the word pistuos in Greek means to trust. It's a relationship word.
Trust in, yes. In
It's
who?
not based on how much you've read. It's not based on what you understand. It's based in the relationship. Do you trust that as your parent, I love you unconditionally?
Well, it's
the
not
answer
trust. It's not trust or faith in ideas. It's trust
No.
and faith in a person.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I always compare it to their relationship to their parent. Do you love your parents? Yes. Why? I don't know. But you trust that they love you? Yeah. Why? I don't know. Exactly. That's faith. That's faith. The consistency of God's word in doing what he says he's going to do for you is what creates that trust. So when people ask, like in Romans, is it the faithfulness of Jesus? Is that the translation? Or is it faith in Jesus that's the translation? And the answer is yes.
Yeah, right.
God's faithfulness to his promise to you is what creates the faith in you to trust that he's actually God. He acts and then he does the action consistently so that you can say consistently, well, he keeps doing it. So I guess I can trust that he's just going to keep doing it.
Right. And that's what I was going to say about the parents. I mean, you can, or husband and wife, all those other relationships, you can break them
Yeah,
by
100%.
not showing up, right? By
Yeah.
not doing and not living according to what you believe.
Right.
But God willing, since none of us do this perfectly or not in the way of God,
Right.
for us in Christ, that we live in his word
Right.
alongside that relationship so that
Right.
we're hearing the word of forgiveness, so we have forgiveness to give to each other.
Right. The only thing
Yeah.
that I know, and I say that know in the sense of trust, the only thing that I know is 100% true is that Jesus died on Friday and rose again on the Sabbath for my justification. And if that's true, then everything else that Scripture says can be true too. Because a man died and came back from the dead 3 days later. And it was God. And if that can be true of God, that he died and rose 3 days from the dead after that, then everything else can be true too. A donkey
Jonah?
can preach the gospel. A man can be swallowed by a giant fish. A snake can talk. Like all of that's possible because Jesus died and rose from the dead.
I even thought about this in regards to the descent into hell, which isn't widely attested in the scriptures.
Right.
It's just Jude and Second
Yeah,
Peter or
he led
whatever.
the captives in his train. Yeah.
Right, but I thought about it. I'm like, but the psalmist often says, "You will not abandon my soul to Sheol.
Yeah.
You will not allow your Holy One to see corruption."
Right.
You can go to everywhere? What's the one where I go to the deepest places? You are there. You know.
That's in the Psalms.
Like, the psalmist is clear that Jesus can go to hell and come back. It's like, I know it's not widely attested, but it's good. He rose from the dead. He can do that.
Right. But I think that's the point, going back to preaching and telling the truth, is that what we're saying is not, here's my criteria based on my personal truths. This is the truth of the gospel based on my personal taste buds, based on my subjective, autonomous decision and definition. We're saying objectively, Jesus died on Friday. That's a historical fact. We call it Friday. They didn't call it Friday. So fine. Jesus died on Calvary at a certain point in time. We measure that from the rule of Augustus and when he began the census, and then we go from there. We also know objectively that he rose from the dead.
He died on the
sixth
testimony.
day.
The sixth
He died
day.
on the sixth day. Thank you. And he rose from the dead 3 days later. He was raised from the dead by the Holy Spirit, according to Paul. Romans
On
chapter
the
1.
eighth day. Yeah.
On the eighth day, and appeared to over 500 people following his resurrection. That's John's gospel. It wasn't the disciples. It wasn't his close friends and family. It was over 500 people.
Actually, it was Paul that testified for that, right?
No, it was John at the end of his, or yeah, Paul, because John says that there was too many things to testify. I was thinking about the other thing. Sorry.
Yeah.
Too much reading. The point is, though, that we attest to the fact that that's historically true, because others attested to the fact that it's historically true. Now, if that's true, what else is true? I don't know, because it's all based on my faith. I believe it, but I can't prove it empirically because I can't get in a time machine and go back and prove that Jonah was swallowed. I can't prove that the fleece was wet on one side, but not on the other side.
Or even that God created 6 days and rested on the seventh.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I can't prove any of that empirically. It can't be reproduced in a lab setting. And so I start from the fact that makes me a Christian, which is Jesus died and rose from the dead. Outside of that, then we can start having a conversation. Well, if that's impossible and that happened, all the other stuff you say is impossible. Maybe God did that too, like create you, create me, send you a preacher to proclaim the gospel of Jesus Christ so that you have forgiveness of sins, new life, and the hope of the resurrection to eternal life. And if that's not covered in the preaching, and if that's not covered in the catechesis, and that's not covered in pastoral care, then you're living a lie or you're participating in a lie. And that's unacceptable because it's your salvation, it's your soul that's at stake. And that's a very serious thing, however, as we've noted nowadays. And I talked about this last week in the preface to the Large Catechism. Most people actually don't even know what the soul is, let alone believe in it. The soul is the seat of life. It's where the Holy Spirit takes up residence in you. Your life is your soul. It's not something that leaves your body and floats away into the heavenly paradise. God breathed the nefesh, the suke. He breathed his breath into the man, and the man lived. What you call your soul is the life that God breathes into you when he makes you.
According to the scriptures. Yes.
According to the scriptures. It's the breath that he will breathe back into you at the resurrection of the dead on the last day. It's not disembodied something. It's his breath.
Right. And you have no life apart from that breath.
And you have no life apart from that. So your soul is very, very important because without it, you are dead twice over. Dead physically and dead to God. So think about it. Your soul is a living testimony to one, that there is a creator who made you. Two, keeps you going because he hasn't taken his breath away from you. It's on rent.
Yeah.
Or on loan, sorry. And three, that maybe he actually cares about you because you're still breathing. And so there's still time. Time to repent. Time to demand that you hear the gospel preached in its truth and purity. Time to receive the body and blood of Jesus for the forgiveness of sins, new life, and salvation. Time to ask your pastor, what does my baptism have to do with my vocation? But if you're not going to tell the truth about Jesus, well then how can you be counted on to tell the truth about anything? Because if you say as a Christian, this is the most important thing. There's nothing that matters more in life than Jesus Christ for me. And you won't tell the truth about that. You're hedging your bets. You're trying to put the best construction on somebody who's abandoned the gospel or turned his back on the sacraments or isn't ministering to you in an evangelical way. If you're going to lie to yourself about that and participate in that, even though it's crushing your soul, How can you be counted on to tell the truth to your teachers of your kids? How you to tell the truth to your doctor, or your nurse, or your pediatrician, or your optometrist, or your dentist, when they tell you, no, you have to do this in order to be serviced by this company, or to continue to work for a company that denies you your religious exemption.
Yeah. It's exhausting. And then, like you said, it's ultimately soul crushing.
Yeah. Because in the end, that's really what you're struggling with, even though you can't name it. And I would argue that what we have more and more, I see this all the time, it's communicated to us, are sheep without shepherds.
Yeah.
They're afraid because they know the wolves and the bears and the lions are out there in the woods. They can hear them. But they're looking around going, but what do we do? Where do we go? And then,
I think, at least in my experience, the wolves they're pretty, I wouldn't say they're tame, but they're pretty tame. They make threats. They make accusations.
They howl.
They prowl around.
Yeah.
They howl. They make a lot of noise. And then we act in fear and response rather than just simply stand up against them, because they're not actually, I mean, obviously there's exceptions like in Soviet Russia.
Yeah.
I mean, there was real terror, and that may come too.
But you're feeding yourself to them. Because again, in the end, it's not a law, it's a mandate. It's the pressure of the community around you. It's peer pressure that ultimately forces you, makes you feel like you're forced to comply and bend the knee and go in that direction, which they're feeding themselves into the mouth of the monster, and they want you to go with them. I go back to the Peretti book, The Prophet, where he's in a mall, and it's cartoonish, but it gets to my point for the analogy. He's in a mall, and God gives him a vision. Everybody in the mall, there's a giant, basically yawning mouth that opens up at one end of the mall, and it's basically hell sucking everything into it. And nobody's fighting it. They're all running into this hole, this maw, this giant mouth that's sucking everything into it. They're running into it gladly, laughing about it, happy. They're not running away from hell. They're not holding on to things, trying not to get sucked into hell. They're running toward it. And that's what I see constantly every day, is people just saying, well, we just go along with it. It's not that bad. It's not hurting anybody. We'll adapt, especially in the upper Midwest anyways. That's kind of the upper Midwestern way. We'll just ignore it and it'll go away eventually. And of course it never does. They just adapt and conform themselves to the pressure.
Well, and if I don't want to go into great detail here. You can go and listen to James Lindsay's 4-part podcast on repressive tolerance.
Yes.
Which was a book by Herbert Marcuse.
Yes.
It's pretty heavy. It's pretty dense. It's probably more dense than this show.
Way denser than this show, yeah.
Yeah. But I put a link in the show notes here. I'll put it in the comments as well, to just the summary from Oxford, reference of philosophy, where it effectively is, repressive tolerance is that you just agree to get along, to go along. Yeah. And he presented this as a good thing, and a means of social change. And the churches have adopted that, right? Yeah. We're gonna help on being repressed, but tolerate it.
Yeah.
And then you end up just being the victim, but you can say, I'm just a victim.
Well, it goes to my point that I said to you last week. It's when people say to me, it's the lesser of two evils, it's still evil.
And are you not calling it evil then? It's kind of a way to hedge your bets, maybe a little bit.
Right. It's like saying it's a white lie, but it's still a lie. You're just acknowledging it's a lie, and then you're trying to give yourself an alibi for lying. The lesser of two evils is evil, period.
Don't lie.
Yeah, don't lie. It's actually covered in the 10 Commandments. If you're all about the legality, it's covered.
I mean, it sounds easy, and I know it's not, but still, what else are you going to do? I mean, because otherwise, like you say, you're just exhausted.
Yeah. That's the thing. If people, again, to point the gun at myself again, to not attack anybody, but people will ask, how do you do so much? How do you have constant energy? What do you do? And it's I tell the truth. Mm-hmm. Then I never have to remember what I said. I never have to worry about whether I said the right thing or not, because even if I tell the truth and I say it in such a way that I hurt you or offend you, it's easy for me to walk that back and go, oh yeah, I can see how that might have hurt you or tweaked and I'm sorry I didn't express myself more clearly or with more kindness.
Right.
But I don't have to sit there and search my memory bank for oh, what did I say to this person at that time versus what I said to her over here. If you know me in any way, what I say in the pulpit, what I say in Bible study, what I say on the street are essentially what I say on social media. It's the same.
Right.
Period. So if you don't like the way I am on social media, definitely don't visit with me in person. It's just that, but more unfiltered. because it's not on social media. But my
Well,
point is, when
but
I
also
got
social
sober,
media is only part
Yeah.
of your
exactly, it's a
person,
snapshot, right?
though. Yeah.
But
Right.
going through sobriety, going through all of that, and that's one of the biggest things that you have to learn is that, at least for myself, I became a pathological liar because that's just an offshoot of my addiction. You have to lie to everybody to maintain the addictive lifestyle. And everybody around you is lying all the time too. So it's birds of a feather. It's honor amongst thieves.
Mm-hmm.
And so when you get sober and you accept responsibility for this just path, like sometimes decades long, just lies, just a road that's been paved with lies. A cornerstone of your sobriety is always tell the truth, always take responsibility for what you say and do, and then always accept the consequences, good, bad, or otherwise. It's a foundation, building block, cornerstone of your sobriety. And so you have to actually teach yourself and learn how to tell the truth, because the temptation, even for me to the present tense, and I think this is true of everybody, it's just that, like I said, through sobriety, you become hyper aware of it. The temptation is to exaggerate. The temptation is to cut corners and tell white lies. The temptation is to present yourself as someone you're not to try and impress people, versus tell the truth. Let people make up their own minds about whether they like you, dislike you, are indifferent about you, whether what you're saying is true or not. Let other people make that choice for themselves, and stop worrying so much about what other people think about you, and ask, again, like we said, in relation to God, what does God think of me? What does his word say to me? And
He
if you're
loves
not
me.
getting,
He really loves me.
He loves me. He really loves me. Just like Mikey in Post Serial.
Mm-hmm.
Give it to Mikey. He'll eat anything. If your pastor is not telling you the truth, if the people around you in church aren't telling you the truth, figure it out. Get together with others, find other people, pray that God would connect you with other people who are hungry for the truth of the gospel of Jesus Christ, and then get together with them. Like we talked about it, in the previous essay. If you have to form a house church because the gospel's not being preached, the sacraments aren't being administered, and you're not being ministered to by your pastor evangelically, you can make your own house. You can form your own church. I hate to break it to you, but you can just form your own church.
You're so anti-clerical.
But I'm really not, because again, don't quit because you don't like your pastor personally. Don't quit because there's a person or a group of people in church that you don't like. Ask yourself, is the gospel of Jesus Christ being preached in its truth and purity? Are the sacraments being administered in their truth and purity, according to God's word and command? Is your pastor ministering to you evangelically? If not, I think you have to ask yourself some serious questions about your fidelity to that building and that brand and that
Or those
group,
people. Yeah.
those people.
Yeah.
Is it worth it? Because I know for a fact there's people that listen to this podcast who have contacted me about their own family members who have vilified them for turning away from the true path and joined a different church
Right.
based on that criteria that I just laid out. I didn't leave because I don't like you as a family, and I didn't leave because I'm trying to rebel against you or your church or the church that I grew up in. I left because I'm hungry and thirsty for the gospel of Jesus Christ, and I wasn't being fed. It had nothing to do with the pastor. It had nothing to do with you. It had to do with the fact that I was languishing.
Right. Right.
And if you read like Psalm 32 or Psalm 38, and you read how David languishes, those Psalms of lament, where he's just like, I'm dying. I'm just dying. Your hand was heavy upon me. My bones were melting within me because I didn't confess my sin. How are you supposed to confess your sin to a person that will not absolve you of your sin?
Right.
In the name of Jesus Christ specifically. As a called and ordained servant of Christ, and by his command, I declare to you the entire forgiveness of all your sin. How are you supposed to lay your burden down when you're begging for someone to absolve you of your sin and they won't?
Right. Right.
Why stick around?
Well, like I said, that's living in a different kind of lie.
Yeah.
Right. And obviously you have to do the gut check to see, am I deceiving myself? Am I just not listening, etc.?
Yeah,
That's why
exactly.
that conversation should start first and see,
Yeah.
is it just, am I doing for the right thing? Am I
Well,
understanding
follow Jesus in Matthew 18. Go talk to your pastor.
Yep.
And like you said,
You're
don't
right.
accuse, don't point fingers, don't judge him. Have a conversation with your pastor. Feel him out. Ask questions. Let him explain himself to you. The mechanics of, hey, this is how I understand ministry. This is how I prepare my sermons. This is what I think I'm saying when I preach. And if he's open to listen to you, you have, again, it's like Proverbs says, right? That to a wise man, words of reproof, gold. To a fool, waste of time. You'll figure that out.
Yep.
Find other people in the congregation that you talk to that you trust, whose advice and counsel you trust. Talk to them. Get their real thoughts about it outside of church. where they can talk informally with you casually about you. Pray that God would reveal to you whether you're sinning against your pastor in your church or whether they're sinning against you.
Right.
And then, after all of that discernment, then make your choice. I was listening to a podcast the other day that like 90% of suicides occur within 10 minutes of deciding to kill yourself because it's an impulse decision.
Right.
And that if somebody can interrupt that in that moment, recognize the signs and break off that cycle that you're kind of spinning in your own thoughts in your head. It's a circle, and it's a closed circle. It's a feedback loop because there's nobody around you to break you out of that. And so it just spirals until it gets to the end state, which is kill yourself.
Right.
That 10 minutes is crucial to preventing suicide and recognizing this person's spiraling. It's the same thing when you're struggling with the faith, when you're struggling, whether or not you're hearing the gospel, whether you're being hard-hearted and rejecting the gospel or whether that guy up there is just not preaching it.
Mm-hmm.
You can spiral. You can get caught in that feedback loop and start thinking that you're the only person in church who's faithful. You're the only person who knows the truth. You're the only person that understands the gospel. You're not. It's not up to you. So you pray. Like Jesus says to the disciples, they're like, hey, we couldn't exorcise this dude who had demons. And Jesus is like, yeah, because you didn't ask the Father.
Right.
You just thought you could do it because you hang out with me.
Of course, they also said, those guys are casting out demons in your name, but you didn't tell them to do that.
Right,
it's
exactly.
like, leave them alone because they're doing it in my name.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Going back to the essay, I don't care if they're Baptists, Roman Catholics, Russian Orthodox, Lutheran. It doesn't matter at that point. The brand isn't important. What's important is, are they telling the truth?
The brand's only important insofar as it might indicate what they're supposed to say.
Right, exactly.
Or what they say they're going to say.
Right.
But as you and I both experienced, those brandings don't often reflect what's actually said.
Especially nowadays. Right?
Yeah.
Especially
they're
the
almost
last
immaterial.
year and a half.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's true.
So exercise discernment. Pray. Pray that the fruits of the Spirit would be manifest in you, and more importantly, in those who you are holding something against, whether it's failure to preach the gospel, whether it's failure to show you charity and kindness, whether it's failure to extend forgiveness of sins in Jesus' name to you. Pray and be patient. Again, be still and know that I am the Lord, Psalm 46.
Mm-hmm.
I am an ever-present help in trouble. Pray and wait. And maybe it's this podcast. Maybe it's Gillespie or myself communicating with you. Maybe it's talking with another Christian brother or sister who can help walk with you. Yeah. Maybe it's going and talking to your pastor and discovering, hey, he didn't even know this. And he actually thanks you and welcomes the conversation. You don't know. Because again, it's easy to get caught in that kind of autonomous feedback loop of like, this is what I think, and since I think it, it must be right.
Right.
No. My life is the history of me being wrong about most things most of the time. That's my life. And having to say, oh yeah, okay, I got to walk that back now.
Well, and to this other point, your pastor may want to live by the truth, but needs to be encouraged, get encouraged by you, right? Encouraged to say, look, I'm waiting for you to say this. Will you please, say it to me, either now or, and if appropriate, say it in the pulpit too.
There are people in my congregation who hate my preaching. Hate it. And they say it. I hate your sermons. Hate them. I'm like, why are you still here? Because we have the Lord's Supper every Sunday and my friends are here, my family is here, and I like the liturgy. I'm like, cool. You tune out for 8 to 12 minutes every Sunday, go to the bathroom, do what you got to do, but they're still being fed.
Some people tune out for an hour
a lot longer.
Yeah.
But that's why it's important to pick out hymns that preach Christ and a liturgy that preaches Christ and to have the sacrament there because it preaches Christ for the forgiveness of sins so that, they don't like me as their pastor.
Yeah, one way or another.
Or they just like, I hate your sermons. I hate them. I've always hated them, but this is why I'm here. And I'm like, hey, okay, cool. Because to be blunt, I don't like you either. As a person, I don't like you, but I'm not called to like you. I'm called to pastor you. And so I love you. I love you because Jesus loves you. And I see your need for your Savior in even more ways than I need a Savior because I don't like you. And so you make that judgment about people you don't like. You definitely need Jesus more than me. But it's just going to the point is, I'm not here to be your friend. I'm here to preach Christ for you for the forgiveness of sins. And if, whether it's personality, whether it's your disrespect for the office of pastor, or you just don't like the way that I talk in my sermons, you still have the liturgy, you still have the hymns, you still have the sacrament. Because it's not about me. It's not about Donovan. It's about the ministry and it's about the church and the ministry of Christ in the church.
That's objectively true.
Right. And yet of those few that I know of that hate my sermons or just don't like me as a person, it's the others who have come who say, I need you to preach that way every Sunday. I need to hear that. I need the sacrament. I need the liturgy, just like those other people who don't like your sermons. But I also need you to preach that way. I need you to be assertive, and I need you to drive to the truth. Sometimes I don't like what you say, but I know it's what I need to hear. If you cling to Jesus as the truth, if you drive to the forgiveness of sins in Jesus' name, maybe you're not rhetorically the best speaker. Maybe you're not the most effective communicator. It doesn't matter. It's not about your oratory or rhetoric. It's about the truth, who is Jesus, and the Spirit working through those words to affect faith, to strengthen you, to give you hope, and to send you out the door into your vocations with that faith and hope intact.
Good.
Coffee kicked in.
Yep. My coffee's not kicked in.
The double espresso kicked in. No, it incenses me. It incenses me to see people starve, because I've been there. You've been there.
Yeah.
And
you don't have to suffer that. You don't have to suffer that.
The fact that there's food in the fridge and you're forcing people to go hungry on Sundays.
Yeah.
That's not cool.
Right. And the point is that there are those that will feed you.
And there's people coming from Russia to Texas to be fed. And there's people who have been in prison and tortured who remained in their country to continue to preach the truth. Mm-hmm. And you're over here like, man, it's just not convenient for me to go to church at 10 o'clock on a Sunday morning.
Yeah, we're not advocating church shopping here. We are advocating, though, the truth be spoken.
Correct.
Yeah.
100%.
All right.
You got anything else?
No.
Manage your expectations. Manage your expectations in the way of gift and in the way of entitlement. Manage your expectations.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. We'll come back next week, and I can pretty much guarantee we're going to talk about this some more because we haven't finished the essay yet. We got 2 more sections.
Yeah.
So we'll do that. And then, eventually, when we get out of Christian dissonance, we'll maybe go back to Capon and Christianity and talk about it again, kind of cover it, having been changed.
Correct.
And repented. Otherwise, thank you, everybody, for supporting the podcast. Trust me, your support of this podcast means a lot to us. It means a lot to 1517 to let them know that, Banned Books is relevant and vital and important. So we thank you for all of that, because it's your support and your voice that keeps this podcast going, actually.
Yeah.
Without you, we cease to exist on this network. So thank you. Otherwise, we'll talk to you again next week or the week after for a brand new episode. Peace.
All right. Stop recording.
I'm going to turn my Dropbox back on.
All right. Say goodbye to everybody.
Bye, everybody. Thank you for hanging out, even though we went longer than normal.
It happens.
It happens. Riley.